She was 18 years old, and she was standing on a porch that no longer belonged to her, looking at a black garbage bag that did. The bag was not large. That was the thing that stayed with her later in all the years that followed when she thought back to that February afternoon in Asheville, North Carolina. The bag was not large. Everything she owned in the world fit inside a single black plastic bag, the kind you buy in a box of 50 at the dollar store, the kind people use for autumn leaves and old newspapers and the things they no longer want in their lives. She had not packed it. Someone else had packed it for her, and the wrongness of that, the violation of having her own belongings handled by hands that did not care what they were handling, was somehow worse than the eviction itself. Her things had been gathered without tenderness. A sleeve hung out of the knot at the top, the cuff of a sweater she had owned since she was 15, and it moved a little in the cold air like something waving. She stood on the porch for 3 minutes. She counted. Not because she was calm, but because counting was the thing she did when her body wanted to do something else entirely, when it wanted to shake or shout or sit down on the cold boards and stop being a body that had to make decisions. She counted the seconds the way other people breathe, slowly and deliberately pulling numbers up from somewhere deep where panic couldn't reach them. 1, 2, 3. The numbers were old friends. They had carried her through worse than this, though she would have been hard-pressed at that moment to say what worse looked like, because this was the kind of moment that filled the whole frame and left no room around its edges for comparison. The television was on inside the house. She could hear it through the walls, muffled and tinny, the sound of a game show audience applauding something. Someone had won something. The crowd was happy about it. The sound kept going indifferent as weather, and she understood that the man inside was watching it, sitting in the recliner with the worn arms watching strangers win money on a Thursday afternoon, while her childhood sat in a garbage bag on the porch he had locked her out of. Dex Harlow's truck was in the driveway, a gray F-150 with a magnetic sign on the door that said Harlow Gutter Systems and a phone number and a small graphic of a rain cloud with a downward arrow, an arrow meant to indicate the directing of water, the controlling of where water went, which was the whole of his trade. The truck had a crack in the windshield that started at the lower left corner and traveled diagonally across the glass like a river on a map. Dex had driven with that crack for 2 years. He was not a man who fixed things. He was a man who installed systems for moving water off other people's houses and then came home and let his own life accumulate its small damages without addressing any of them. The crack in the glass, the loose gutter on the north side of the eave, the daughter who was not his daughter and whom he had decided on this particular afternoon he was finished with. The front door was locked. She had already tried it. Once quietly without knocking, because knocking would have meant announcing herself, and announcing herself on a night when Dex had been drinking since noon was not something she intended to do. She had stood at the door with her key in her hand and turned it, and felt it stop against a mechanism that had not been there that morning. And she had understood the way you understand a thing that you already knew, but had not yet admitted to knowing that the lock had been changed. He had gone to the hardware store. He had bought a new lock and brought it home and taken out the old one and put in the new one, a process that took most of an hour and required a screwdriver and a small amount of forethought. And during that hour, he had been thinking about her, about how to keep her out, which was its own kind of attention, the only kind he had ever reliably paid her. She picked up the garbage bag. She walked to the bus stop at the end of the block and sat on the bench and waited. The February air was cold and damp, the particular cold of the southern Appalachian winter that doesn't cut like northern cold, but settles into you slow and patient, finding every gap in your clothing and your composure. She had on a denim jacket and the wool sweater she had bought at a thrift store in September for $4, and the pair of boots she had waterproofed herself with a tin of beeswax she found at a hardware store closeout. She had dressed that morning for school and for the bakery shift before it, and for an ordinary day that had not turned out to be ordinary, and now the same clothes had to be the clothes she wore into a life that no longer had a roof attached to it. She was small, not just young, but physically small in a way that had defined her entire life. At 18, she could still be mistaken for 14, by anyone who didn't look closely, and most people did not look closely. She had the kind of smallness that made adults speak in simplified sentences and made peers dismiss her before she opened her mouth. She had spent years being underestimated, overlooked, talked over at tables and passed in hallways, and through as though she were not quite fully solid. It had been a wound for a long time, the not being seen. And then somewhere in the years of it, the wound had inverted itself and become a skill. It had taught her to pay attention. When the world decides you are not worth watching, you are free to watch the world. And she had watched it, all of it, with an attention so complete and so quiet that people forgot she was there and went on being themselves in front of her. And she had learned more about how people actually worked than most people learn in their whole lives. She watched it now from the bus stop bench. The street was quiet. The houses on either side were lit from inside warm yellow rectangles against the gray evening, each one containing a life she would never know anything about. Families sitting down to dinner or not sitting down to dinner. Arguments and reconciliations and the ordinary, unremarkable continuation of people who got to keep their keys. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something real or imagined a steady rhythmic complaint into the dusk. A car went past with music playing something with a heavy bass that she felt in her sternum before she heard it, with her ears the sound arriving in her chest first and her head second, the way the most important things often did. The bus came and she got on and rode it downtown, the garbage bag on the seat beside her like a passenger. And she looked out the window at the town she had grown up in, going past in the dark. And she did not cry because crying drew attention, and attention had never once in her life made anything better. Her mother's name was Vera. Vera Holloway had been 24 years old when Lark was born, a woman with quick dark eyes and a laugh that started in her shoulders and worked its way up, the kind of laugh that made other people laugh even when they didn't know what was funny. She had grown up in Buncombe County, the daughter of a tobacco farmer and a church organist, and she had been the first person in her family to go to college. She had studied pre-veterinary biology at UNC Asheville, spent 2 years cutting her way through organic chemistry and animal physiology and comparative vertebrate anatomy, the hardest courses the school offered, and she had done well in them, well enough that the vet program at NC State had accepted her, which was no small thing for a girl from a tobacco farm whose people had never sent anyone past the 11th grade. She had been 23 years old and standing at the edge of a life that was about to open into something large when she found out she was pregnant. She did not finish the program. She came home instead, had Lark in the small apartment on Merriman Avenue, and worked for a while as a vet tech at a clinic on the south side of town. She was good at it. She had the steadiness that animals respond to, the quality of presence that makes a frightened creature understand without words that the person touching it means no harm. Dogs that snapped at everyone else grew quiet under her hands. Cats that hid under examination tables came out for her. There was a gift in it, a real gift, the kind that cannot be taught and can only be recognized. And the veterinarian she worked for recognized it and told her she should finish the program. She should go back. She was wasting something. She always smiled when they said it and never answered, because the answer was money and time, and a small child in an apartment that leaked when it rained, and those were not things you could solve by being good with animals. Lark's father was not in the picture, had never been in the picture, was a name on a birth certificate and nothing else. A young man who had left the state before Lark was born and had never written and never called and had become over the years a kind of absence shaped like a person, a hole in the family with a man's name attached to it. So when Vera met Dex Harlow at a church potluck when Lark was 6 years old, and Dex was cheerful and employed and had a house in North Asheville with a paid mortgage and a yard with a climbing tree in it, Vera did what people do when they are tired and afraid and can see a door that might close if they don't walk through it now. She married him. She married the house and the paid mortgage and the climbing tree and the idea of a man who would be there. And the man came attached to all of it. And for a while, it seemed like a fair trade. For a while, things were fine. The way things are often fine at first, before the weight of what they actually are begins to show through the surface of what they appear to be. Dex was amiable when he was sober, which in those early years was most of the time. He coached Lark's soccer team for one season when she was 8, though he never learned the rules well and mostly stood on the sideline with a coffee cup that Lark later understood had not contained coffee. He remembered her birthday with a card and cash. He said yes when Vera asked him things and did not raise his voice in the first years, at least not often. He had a way of being pleasant that was real as far as it went. And the trouble was that it did not go very far, that there was a floor under the pleasantness, and below the floor was a basement. And below the basement was something colder still, and the bourbon was the elevator that traveled down through all of it. The bourbon came later, or rather, the bourbon was always there, but the volume increased, the way things increase when no one is paying attention. Gradually, then suddenly, with the transition happening somewhere in the middle, where no single moment could be identified as the one where things changed. There was no night you could point to and say that was the night he became this. There was only the slow accumulation of nights, each one slightly worse than the average of the ones before it. Until one day you looked up and the man who had coached soccer was a man you organized your evenings around avoiding, and you could not say when the change had happened because it had happened in increments too small to see and only became visible in the aggregate. The way you cannot watch a child grow, but you can look at last year's photograph and be startled. Vera responded by becoming smaller. There is a particular survival strategy that certain people develop under certain conditions, a kind of studied invisibility where you reduce the surface area of yourself that the world can reach. You speak less, you move quietly, you do not assert, do not insist, do not push back or push forward or draw the kind of attention that creates friction. You become a background presence, reliable and silent, and you hope that if you ask nothing of the room, you will be asked nothing in return. It is not a good strategy. It does not work in the end because the kind of anger that fills a house like that will find a target whether or not the target makes itself small. But it is a strategy that makes sense from the inside, when you are inside it, when the alternatives all look worse, and Vera had chosen it the way you choose the least painful of several painful things, and she had paid for the choice with herself, piece by piece, year by year. Vera became this. Lark watched it happen. She was 7, then 8, then 10, then 12, watching her mother dissolve herself into the woodwork of a house that had never quite fit either of them. Watching Vera's laugh appear less often, and then rarely, and then almost never watching the veterinary textbook on the shelf above the washing machine gather dust. The book was still there. The book was always still there. A thick volume with a diagram of a horse's skeleton on the cover, its pages dog-eared from years of study, its margins filled with Vera's careful pencil notes from when she was 22, and the whole world was still in front of her. Lark had sometimes taken it down when she was alone in the house, opened it to random pages, read her mother's handwriting in the margins, the small, precise observations, the underlinings, the question marks beside the hard parts, and understood that she was reading the record of a person who had existed before she became the person she was now. There was a woman in those margins, a woman with a future. Lark had grown up with her mother and had also grown up with that woman, the ghost of her, the person Vera had been before Lark and before Dex and before the slow subtraction of everything, and she had loved them both and grieved them both and never figured out how to say either thing out loud. Lark learned to be invisible too. She learned it the way children learn everything, by watching and imitating and practicing until the imitation becomes the thing itself. She learned to walk on the balls of her feet so the floorboards didn't announce her mapping the house in her mind, by which boards creaked and which held silent so that she could cross the whole of it in the dark without making a sound. She learned to read with the light off, holding a book close to her face and using the amber glow of the street lamp outside her bedroom window, because a light under the door was an invitation and she had learned not to issue invitations. She learned the sound of Dex's truck in the driveway, the particular engine note, and the particular way the door closed that told her whether he was coming home straight from work or coming home by way of the Maplewood Lounge on Weaverville Road. And she adjusted the evening accordingly, the way a small animal adjusts to the shadow of a hawk, without deliberation, by instinct refined into reflex. She got the job at Flour and Stone Bakery when she was 16, talking her way into it by showing up at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday without being asked, and asking the woman who answered the door if she needed any help. The woman was Blythe Sutton, who was at that time 58 years old and had been running the bakery alone since her husband Terrence had died of a heart attack in the kitchen 3 years prior, gone between one batch of bread and the next found by Blythe, when she came in from the front of the shop wondering why the oven timer was going and no one had answered it. Blythe was a large woman, not heavy, but physically imposing, with forearms that had been developed by 40 years of kneading dough into something that resembled carpentry tools. She had silver hair cut short and eyes that were the particular pale gray of winter sky over the mountains, and she called everyone by the name she decided to give them, regardless of what their parents had named them, so that her regulars answered to honey and sugar and hon and friend, and in the case of one elderly man who came every morning for a single cinnamon roll, Your Honor, for reasons no one had ever asked her to explain. She looked at Lark standing in the doorway at 4 in the morning, a small girl in a thrift store coat with the street light still on behind her, and she did not ask any of the questions that a more cautious or a more conventional person would have asked. She said, "You're tiny, can you lift 40 pounds? Lark said, "Yes, ma'am." Blythe said, "We'll see. Come in." Lark could lift 40 pounds. She could lift it and carry it and set it down without dropping it, and go back for more without being asked. And Blythe, who had spent 3 years being understaffed and overtired, recognized this quality and paid for it at $9 an hour in cash, 4:30 to 7 5 days a week before school. Lark swept floors and washed mixing bowls the size of satellite dishes and loaded the display cases with the breads that Blythe had been baking since midnight. The sourdoughs and the ryes and the honey, whole wheats and the dense dark country loaves that tasted like something her grandmother might have made if her grandmother had been a professional baker with 40 years of practice and a very specific philosophy about what bread was for. And in those early mornings in the warm, flour-smelling dark of the bakery, with Blythe working the dough at the big table and the radio playing low and the ovens ticking, Lark had found the first place in her life that felt like it might be safe, the first room she could be in without monitoring the exits. She saved the money. She kept it in a Ziploc bag inside a wool sock inside her backpack, which she took everywhere, including the shower, because a backpack in your possession is harder to take than a backpack on a shelf. She had $214 in the sock when Dex threw her out. She had been saving for 8 months. She had planned to save for another year to have enough to leave on her own terms, to walk out a door she had chosen rather than be pushed through a door someone else had locked behind her. She had not accounted for the lock being changed. She had not accounted for the timeline being decided by someone other than her, which, when she thought about it later, was the story of her entire childhood compressed into a single afternoon. Blythe was still at the bakery when Lark came through the door at 5:30 that evening. The shop had been closed for hours, but Blythe kept baker's hours even when the baking was done, filling the afternoon with orders and inventory and the ongoing quiet war against the health department's definition of acceptable flour storage. She was wiping down the stainless steel counter at the back of the shop when the door opened and Lark walked in with a garbage bag over her shoulder and an expression that was neither distress nor composure, but something in between, the particular look of someone who has decided not to feel something until they are somewhere safe enough to feel it. Blythe looked at her. She looked at the bag. She set down the rag. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make toast." She said it the way certain people say certain things, without inflection, without performance, in a tone that contained both instruction and absolution. The tone of someone who has been a safe harbor long enough that it has become structural part of how they are built, rather than something they decide to be. She did not ask what had happened. She did not say, "Oh, honey," or "Oh, no," or any of the things that would have required Lark to manage someone else's feelings on top of her own. She said, "Sit down and I'll make toast," which were two things a person could do, two concrete things in a world that had just turned abstract and frightening. And Lark sat at the small table in the back of the bakery, the one where Blythe ate her own meals between shifts, and set the garbage bag on the floor beside the chair, and put her hands flat on the table and breathed. The toast came with butter and a jar of raspberry jam that Blythe had made herself from berries she bought at the farmer's market in August, and a glass of cold whole milk, and Lark ate all of it without tasting it. But it was warm and it was there, and those two things were enough. Blythe made phone calls. She stood at the counter with the phone against her ear, her free hand resting on her hip, and made 3 calls in succession, speaking in the low practical voice she used when organizing things that needed to be organized. She did not explain to Lark what she was doing. She simply did it, which was its own form of kindness, the kindness of treating a catastrophe as a logistics problem, of refusing to make it any larger than it had to be. When the 3rd call ended, she set the phone down and leaned against the counter. "There is a cot in the back room," she said, "behind the flour storage. You can sleep there tonight, as long as you need really, but tonight for sure." Lark said, "Thank you." "I also," Blythe said, "have a lead on something. It's a strange one. I want you to hear me all the way out before you make a face." She crossed her arms. "My cousin Merle owns a piece of property up in Madison County, past Hot Springs, back in the mountains far enough from the road that the county forgot about it for a while. Old grist mill. Stone building sits right on a creek. Been empty since Silas Greer died in 1962. She paused. She was watching Lark carefully, the way she watched bread in the oven, looking for the precise moment when it crossed from not done to done. "The county put it up for tax sale years ago and then again, and nobody ever bid because nobody in their right mind wants it. It's been on the list for so long they keep it there out of habit. It went on at $10. Lark was quiet for a moment. "$10, she said. "That's what I said." "What's wrong with it?" Blythe smiled. It was a specific kind of smile, the kind that tells the truth about something complicated without resorting to simple language. "Everything is wrong with it. The roof leaks, the water wheel is broken, the last quarter-mile of the trail washed out twice in the past decade. There's no power, no running water, no road anywhere near it. You can't drive to it. You walk in 2 miles along the creek and there it sits. The county tried to bring in equipment to demolish it in 2008, and the contractor took one look at the terrain and said no, and they tried again in 2015, and the second fellow didn't even finish looking before he said no. It is by every reasonable measure worthless." She paused again. "But the stones are solid. The creek is clean, and nobody is going to knock on that door at midnight and change the locks. Nobody's going to come up that trail to bother you because nobody comes up that trail at all." She let that sit. She let it sit because she was a wise woman, and she had understood somewhere in the 3 phone calls, in the toast, what the actual shape of Lark's wound was. And she knew that the words she had just spoken landed in that wound, like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting its whole life to be turned. Lark understood what she was being offered. Not just a piece of property, a different kind of equation entirely. A place where the rules were made by physics and weather rather than by someone else's anger and someone else's fear. A place where the loudest sound in the night was water over stone. She had spent her entire life being bothered, being watched, being managed, being made small by the noise of other people. And here was an old woman offering her a building 2 miles from anyone, a stone box on a creek where she could exist without being monitored or evaluated or accounted for. The idea of it was so large she could barely look at it directly. It was worth more than $10. It was worth everything she had. "Yes," Lark said, "I want to see it." Blythe drove her to the Madison County Courthouse the next morning in the bakery delivery van, which smelled like sourdough starter and old diesel, and had a crack in the passenger side sun visor that had been repaired with a strip of duct tape that was beginning to peel at both ends. The van made a sound on hills that was not quite distress, but was close to it, a low laboring whine that rose and fell with the grade. Blythe drove it without concern, one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the gear shift, talking occasionally and falling silent for long stretches in between, comfortable with quiet in the way of people who have spent enough years alone to stop being afraid of it. Madison County was mountain country, the kind of terrain that makes people who are not from there understand immediately why people who are from there never leave. The French Broad River ran through Marshall, the county seat, and the town existed in the narrow corridor between the river on one side and the mountains that rose straight up on the other, so that the whole of it felt like a settlement at the bottom of the world, pressed down by elevation, held in place by water. The courthouse was a brick building with white columns and an American flag out front that had been there in one form or another since before the Civil War. A flag that had watched the town flood and rebuild and flood again. A flag that had seen everyone who had ever bought or sold or inherited or lost a piece of this hard, beautiful country come up its steps to make it official. The clerk's office was on the second floor. The clerk was a man in his mid-50s with a neatly trimmed mustache and the careful, cautious manner of someone who has processed enough strange transactions to have stopped being surprised by them without quite having stopped noticing them. He had a paper coffee cup on the corner of his desk and a framed photograph of two retrievers on the wall behind him. Golden dogs in a green field. The kind of photograph that tells you the most important thing about a man before he has said a word. He looked at the listing. He looked at Lark, taking in her size and her age, and the gap between both and the transaction in front of him. He looked at Blythe, whom he appeared to know slightly the way everyone in a small county knows everyone else slightly. He looked back at the listing. "The old Greer mill up on Beckett Creek," he said. It was not quite a question. "That's the one," Blythe said. He folded his hands on the desk. "Miss, I'm obligated to tell you some things, and I'm going to tell you all of them because I'd rather you hear them from me at this desk than learn them yourself 2 miles up a creek with the light going. That property is 2 miles from the nearest maintained road. There is no vehicle access past the Forest Service turnaround at Route 212. The structure has been unoccupied since 1962. The roof is compromised on the western side. The flooring on the upper level has not been inspected since a county assessor went up there in 1987 and wrote in his report, and I am quoting from memory, but I am quoting closely that he would not do so again. He adjusted his coffee cup a quarter inch to the left, for no apparent reason, a small ritual of a man who liked things squared. The county attempted demolition in 2008. The contractor assessed the access route, submitted a revised estimate 3 times the original quote, and ultimately declined the project. In 2015, a second contractor was retained. He drove to the trailhead, hiked approximately half a mile, turned around, and submitted a bill for his time and nothing else. He let that sit. I tell you this so you understand that the building you are proposing to buy has defeated grown men with heavy machinery and county contracts. It is not a fixer-upper. It is a ruin in a place that does not want to be reached. He looked at the $10 bill Lark had set on the corner of his desk, a single worn bill she had taken from the Ziploc bag and the wool sock, more money in proportion to what she owned than most people will ever spend on anything. "You understand what you're buying," he said. It was not a question this time either. It was the kind of statement that contains a question inside it, the way a stone wall contains space. "I do," Lark said. He looked at her a moment longer. Whatever he saw, it seemed to satisfy him, or at least to release him from further obligation. He picked up a pen. "You'll sign here," he said, "and here, an initial here where it says you've been informed of the structural advisory." She signed. Her signature was small and neat, like everything about her. And when she was done, the man took the $10 bill and made change for nothing, gave her a receipt, and slid a thin folder of documents across the desk. The deed and the tax record and the structural advisory she had just initialed, and the Greer mill, which had defeated heavy machinery and county contracts, and 60 years of abandonment, belonged to an 18-year-old girl with a garbage bag of clothes and $204 to her name. Blythe drove her as far as the road went, which ended at a gravel turnaround at the edge of the Pisgah National Forest. There was a trailhead marker, brown wood with carved white letters, and a bulletin board under a metal roof with a map in a plastic sleeve, and some notices about bear activity and fire restrictions, the laminated paper curled and fogged with age. Blythe hugged her at the van. She was a substantial hugger, the kind of person whose embrace is a structural event, and Lark, who did not much like being touched, who had spent years keeping her body out of reach, allowed it because there are arms that take and arms that give, and these were the second kind. Blythe pressed a paper bag into Lark's hands, bread and sharp cheddar, and 2 apples and a packet of peanut butter crackers, the provisioning of someone who had fed people her whole life and did not know how to send anyone anywhere empty-handed. "There is a payphone at the gas station in Hot Springs," she said, "7 miles back on 2570. Call me when you get there, when you've seen it, when you've decided what you think. If I don't hear from you in 3 days, I will come up that trail myself, and I am not as quiet about it as you would be." Lark shouldered her backpack and picked up the bag. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Blythe said. "Go look at what you bought." The trail followed Beckett Creek upstream into the national forest, 2 miles of packed earth path winding through a forest that had been old when the first settlers came through these mountains and had not become younger since. Tulip poplars with trunks 3 feet across, rising straight and limbless for 40 feet before the first branches. Hemlocks so thick and dark they turn the light beneath them to a deep green underwater, the kind of dark that has its own temperature. Rhododendron thickets that had grown together over the trail into tunnels, the branches interlocked overhead so that walking through them was like walking through a series of low green rooms, each one opening into the next, each one cool and close, and smelling of leaf rot and cold water, and the particular clean mineral smell of stone that has been wet for 100 years. The creek was always audible. It ran fast over smooth, pale stones, the water moving with the particular urgency of mountain water that is always going somewhere and is very certain about where. It made a constant sound, not quite music, not quite speech, but somewhere in between, a murmuring that seemed to carry meaning without being translatable, like a conversation in the next room that you can hear but cannot make out. She had grown up in a house full of sounds. She had learned to decode footsteps and ice against glass, and the specific note of a television turned up to cover something else. Sounds that were always information, always warnings, always the prelude to a decision she would have to make about where to put her body. This was a different kind of listening. The creek had nothing to hide. It was not a warning. It was just water telling the truth about itself over and over with no agenda, but to keep going downhill. And she found that she could listen to it without her shoulders rising toward her ears, which was a thing she had not known her shoulders did until she felt them come down. She walked for 45 minutes. The trail climbed gradually. The valley narrowed. The light shifted as the canopy closed overhead, going from pale February sun to the diffuse green glow of winter forest, the bare branches of the hardwoods patterned against the sky like old writing in a language she almost understood. She passed a small waterfall, 4 or 5 feet, the water dropping over dark rock into a pool that was perfectly transparent, the pebbles on the bottom each distinct, each holding still in the current. She passed the ruins of something, a chimney standing alone in the forest surrounded by the fallen evidence of the house. It had once served a scatter of old wood softened to the color of the earth, a home that had had people in it. Once a fire on that hearth voices, and was now just a stone column standing in the trees with nothing left to keep warm. She passed a stand of river birch whose white bark was peeling in long curls, each curl revealing a surface beneath the color of pale copper. She was used to being alone. She had spent years being alone in rooms full of people, alone at the dinner table, alone at school, alone in the particular way you are alone, when the people around you have decided, consciously or not, that you occupy less space than you actually do. That kind of aloneness had a weight to it, the weight of being unseen by people who were present, of being a ghost in your own life while still expected to do the dishes. This was different. The forest did not see her, but it also did not see her. It simply existed in all its enormous, indifferent aliveness, and she existed inside it, and neither fact diminished the other. For the first time she could remember being alone, was not something that had been done to her. It was something she had chosen, something she had walked into on purpose with her own 2 feet 2 miles up a creek. And the difference between those two kinds of aloneness was the difference between a cage and a room with the door standing open. Then around a bend where the creek curved hard around a shoulder of exposed rock, the trail opened and she saw it. The mill. It sat directly over the water. That was the first thing she understood, not that it was built beside the creek, but that it was built over it, spanning the narrow gorge at a point where the banks drew close together and the water moved fast through a channel of bedrock. The building straddled the creek the way a bridge straddles a river, its stone walls rising from the creek bed itself, the water running through a low-arched opening at the base of the downstream wall. The arch was perhaps 3 feet high and 4 feet wide, cut through the stone with a precision that spoke of someone who had known exactly what they were doing. And through this arch, even now, even in February, with the water running low, you could hear the creek passing beneath the floor, the sound of it amplified and shaped by the stone around it. The building was stone, rough-cut blocks of blue-gray mountain granite fitted together without mortar in the tradition of the Appalachian Highlands, each stone chosen for the way its irregular face would lock against its neighbors. The whole structure held together not by adhesive, but by geometry, and the accumulated weight of itself, a kind of construction that requires more skill and more patience than mortared walls, and lasts longer than any of the men who build it. The walls were 2 feet thick. Lichen had grown on them for 150 years, patches of pale green and silver gray that softened the edges of the cut stone, and Virginia creeper had climbed the eastern wall from foundation to roofline, its stems bare in winter, but still clinging, still holding its claim. The building was 2 stories, maybe 25 feet wide and 35 feet long. The lower level was the mill room, the working heart of the thing, its floor slightly below the level of the creek banks, so that the water had been channeled to arrive at the wheel with the maximum force the terrain could provide. The upper level was the living quarters, 2 windows on each of the 4 walls, the glass long gone, the openings facing the forest in every direction like 8 blind eyes. The water wheel was on the creek side south facing, attached to the exterior wall at the level of the lower floor. It had once been perhaps 12 feet in diameter, a traditional overshot wheel designed to receive water from a sluice gate above and be turned by the falling weight of the water rather than the flow alone. 3 of its wooden paddles were missing. A 4th hung at an angle attached at one end, only swinging slightly in the current that moved through the channel below. The wooden axle had cracked lengthwise, a split that ran along its grain for most of its visible length. The whole structure leaned away from the building at the top, as though it had been slowly pulling free for 60 years and had simply not finished the process, a thing in the long act of dying that had not yet quite died. The roof was wooden shingles. On the eastern side, it was intact, weathered gray-brown, the shingles cupped with age but still in place. On the western side, roughly a quarter of the surface was bare, exposing the rafters beneath dark old-growth wood, dense and hard, the kind of timber that doesn't rot quickly even when exposed. Through the gap in the roof, she could see a section of the sky pale blue and very cold. The front door faced the trail. It was heavy oak gray with age hung on iron hinges that had rusted to the color of dried blood. The upper hinge had pulled free of the stone frame on one side, so the door rested at an angle, its lower corner against the threshold, its upper corner leaning into the opening. It was not closed. It had not been fully closed in years. But the stones were solid. She could see that even from the trail. The walls were straight, the corners were plumb, the foundation, which was the creek bed itself, was bedrock, and you cannot improve on bedrock. This building had been standing here for over 150 years, and it looked to her eye like it could stand for 150 more if someone cared enough to give it a roof and a reason. Lark stood on the trail and looked at all of this for a long time, and what she felt was not dismay at the work, but something closer to recognition, the feeling of meeting a thing that had been treated the way she had been treated, abandoned, condemned, written off by people with machinery and authority, and had refused simply by the fact of its construction to fall down. Then she pushed past the crooked door and went in. The mill room was a single large space, low-ceilinged with heavy oak beams, stone floor. The whole room permeated by the sound and smell of the creek running beneath it. The grinding stones were still there, two circular granite millstones, each about 3 feet in diameter and 8 inches thick, set one on top of the other on a wooden mounting frame in the center of the room. The upper stone, the runner, was fitted with a vertical iron rod at its center that had once connected it through a series of wooden gears to the axle of the water wheel. The gearing mechanism was partially collapsed against the back wall, the wooden gear teeth soft with rot, in places the iron fittings brown with rust, but the basic structure was recognizable. You could see what it had been. You could see what it had done. She stood in the center of the mill room beside the grinding stones and put her hand on the upper stone. It was cold. It was very cold and very hard and absolutely immovable, and pressing her palm against it. She felt the weight of the thing, not just its physical weight, but the accumulated weight of what it had done. The decades of grain reduced to flour. The corn and wheat and rye brought up the creek trail on the backs of people from this valley, ground here and taken home and made into bread and cornbread, and the things that kept people alive through the winters when the mountains were sealed under snow and the nearest store was a day's walk away. The stone had fed people. For longer than anyone now living had been alive, this stone had fed people, and then it had stopped, and the people had found other ways to be fed, and the stone had sat here in the dark for 60 years, waiting, the way the mill itself had waited, the way the whole place seemed to have been waiting, for someone to come and give it back its purpose. She took her hand off the stone. The staircase was in the corner, narrow, steep, the treads worn in the center to a concave smoothness by decades of feet going up and coming down. She tested each step before committing her weight to it, the way she had tested every floorboard in the house in Asheville, and the wood creaked and shifted, but did not give. The upper room was the living quarters. One large space with stone walls and a wooden floor of wide chestnut planks, dark with age. The grain visible in long rippled lines that ran the length of each board. The marks of an adze still faintly visible where the wood had been hand-finished a century and a half ago. 2 windows on each wall, the stone frames precise and square despite the roughness of everything around them. The openings framing the forest outside like paintings placed by someone who understood the value of what they were showing. A stone fireplace against the back wall, its chimney running up through the damaged roof. The damper was closed. It had been closed since 1962. An iron bed frame in the corner, the mattress long gone. A wooden table and 1 chair against the wall, both dusty but solid. She crossed to the fireplace and sat down on the edge of the hearth, her boots on the stone, and looked at the room. The pale winter light came through all 8 windows and fell on the chestnut floor at different angles, each window casting its own shape, the shape shifting slightly as the bare branches outside moved in the cold air. It was the most peaceful room she had ever been in. There was no one in it but her. There was no one within 2 miles of it but her. No one knew she was here except an old woman in a bakery 7 miles down a mountain road. And that fact, which would have frightened most 18-year-old girls, settled over Lark like a blanket. She noticed the floor. She noticed it the way she noticed everything. Not all at once, but piece by piece, her attention moving across the room the way light moves across a surface, picking out the details that other people walk past. Near the fireplace, several of the wide chestnut planks were different from the others. They did not sit flush. When she stood and shifted her weight to them, they moved a subtle rocking, barely perceptible, the kind of thing that most people would attribute to age and walk away from. She did not walk away from it. She had spent her whole life noticing the difference between a board that was simply old and a board that was hiding something, between a door that was locked and a door that was about to be locked, between a silence that meant peace and a silence that meant a storm was building. Noticing was how she had survived. She knelt and pressed down on the plank nearest the fireplace. It lifted at the far end. She ran her fingers along its edges, found where it had been cut short of the joist designed to be removable, fitted to look like part of the floor while coming up clean for anyone who knew to lift it. She lifted it, then the one beside it, then three more. Beneath the floor in the cavity between the chestnut planks and the ceiling of the mill room below was a wooden crate. Handmade rough sawn fitted together with square nails that had darkened to the color of the wood. Rope handles on each side, the rope stiff and dry with age. It was heavy when she grasped the handles, heavier than its size suggested, and she had to brace her small frame and lift with her legs to bring it up through the gap in the floor and set it on the chestnut planks in the green light coming through the windows. Inside the crate, wrapped in canvas that had been waxed, rubbed with beeswax on both surfaces to make it waterproof and then folded around its contents with the careful, deliberate attention of someone packaging something they expected to last, were 12 mason jars. She set them out one by one on the chestnut floor. They caught the pale light from the windows and held it in ways that depended on what was inside them. Some held coins, silver dollars and half dollars, stacked tight, the coins pressing against the glass so that you could see the edges of them, the ridged rims, the profiles of presidents and eagles. Some held paper money, old bills rolled tight and packed in dents, the glass heavy when she lifted it. Some held a combination layers of coins and folded currency alternating up the height of the jar, packed with the care of someone who understood that what they were saving mattered. She opened the first one. The zinc lid had a good seal. It came off with the sound of pressure releasing the brief exhalation of a space that had been closed for 66 years, the air of 1958 escaping into the air of now. She pulled out a coin, a Morgan silver dollar, the date worn but legible. 1921. She turned it over in her fingers. The eagle on the back had a quality of detail that modern coins had lost somewhere in the past 100 years, a particular crispness and density that made it feel like it had been made to last, which it had. It was still here. The man who had put it in this jar was 60 years dead, and the coin was still here, still heavy, still silver, still worth what it had always been worth and more. She opened every jar. She sat on the chestnut floor of the upper room of a grist mill on Beckett Creek in Madison County, North Carolina, with 12 open mason jars arranged in a semicircle around her, and the pale green light of the February forest coming through 8 empty windows. And she counted slowly the way she counted everything, the numbers steadying her hands as she sorted the bills into stacks and the coins into rows. The paper currency totaled $19,400. Old bills mostly from the 1940s and 1950s, some earlier all legal tender, all preserved by the wax-sealed jars and the stable, cool temperature of the space between the floors. The coins she could not fully assess without research, but even by weight and basic denomination, she could see they were silver. Real silver, the kind of coins that derive their value not just from their face amount, but from the metal they were made of. $12,800 in silver value. She would later learn when she took them to a coin dealer in Asheville, who spent 40 minutes with them weighing and examining and consulting a worn reference book, and who came out from behind his counter looking like a man who had seen something he had not expected to see on an ordinary Tuesday. $32,200. She did not jump up. She did not cry out. She sat very still on the chestnut floor and looked at the jars and felt something she could not immediately name. It was not happiness, though happiness was part of it. It was not relief, though relief was part of it too. It was something larger and more disorienting, the feeling of a door opening in a wall that you had not known had a door in it, into a room that you had not known existed, and the room was full of light, and you were not sure yet whether you were allowed to go in. At the bottom of the crate beneath the last jar was a leather pouch, small, tied with a piece of brown twine that had aged to a dusty tan, the leather itself darkened and stiff but intact. She untied it. Inside the pouch was a folded piece of paper. The folds were fragile, and she opened it carefully, the paper dry under her fingertips. Written in pencil in a hand that was careful and deliberate but unpracticed, the letters formed with the attention of someone who had not written much, but who took seriously what they were saying. My name is Silas Greer. I have run this mill since 1921. My father ran it before me since 1889. My grandfather built it in 1871 with stones he cut from the creek bed. This money is what I have earned and saved over nearly 40 years of milling corn and wheat for the people of this valley. I put it here because banks are for flatlanders, and I am not a flatlander. If you are reading this, you have found my mill and you have found my savings. Use them to keep the mill standing. The stones are good. The creek is clean. The wheel can be fixed. A mill is a useful thing. A place that turns grain into flour is a place that feeds people. As long as it stands, someone will be fed. She read the letter twice, then she read it a third time. There was a steadiness in it, a refusal of self-pity that she recognized that felt like meeting someone across a distance of 60 years who had learned the same hard lessons she had learned and had arrived at the same conclusions, that the work was the thing, that being useful was the thing, that a building that fed people was worth more than the man who built it and would outlast him if he did it right. Then she turned the paper over. On the back, in the same careful hand, but with different pressure, the letters slightly larger, slightly less controlled, as though written at a different time and under different conditions, as though the man's hand had not been entirely steady when he wrote it. Clara, my girl, if you find this first, the mill is yours. I built every stone of it for you. She did not know who Clara was. She held the paper and looked at those two lines and understood that she was holding something that had been meant for someone else, written by a man who had put everything he had into a wooden crate and covered it with chestnut planks and walked out of this building in April of 1958 in the last years of his life, believing that someday someone would come. He had not known it would be her. He had hoped it would be someone else, a girl named Clara, a girl he had loved enough to build a mill for and to save a fortune for and to write to in a hand that shook a little, a girl who had never come back for any of it. But Lark had come and Silas was gone, and the mill was here and the money was here and the words were here. She folded the letter very carefully. She put it back in the leather pouch and tied the twine. She set the pouch on the floor beside the jars, slightly apart from them, because the money was one kind of thing and the letter was another kind of thing entirely, and she understood the difference even then in the first hour before she understood anything else. Then she sat in the green winter light of the Greer mill on the chestnut floor that Silas Greer had walked across for nearly 40 years and listened to the creek running under her feet, steady and cold and constant, speaking its low, indistinct language to the stones. Outside, the bare trees held the sky. The creek moved east toward the French Broad. The water wheel stood still in the cold air, its broken paddles hanging at their angles, its cracked axle waiting. She was 18 years old. She had a garbage bag of clothes, a backpack, and $204 remaining in a Ziploc bag and a wool sock. She had a crumbling building over a mountain creek that she had bought for $10. She had a letter from a dead man who had saved his whole life for a daughter who never came, and a question she did not yet know she would spend the next year answering. She had spent a long time in a house that wanted her invisible. That was over now. The first thing she did was deposit the money. She walked back down the trail the morning after she found it 2 miles in the cold gray light of early February. The leather pouch with Silas Greer's letter in the front pocket of her jacket, and the 12 mason jars wrapped in clothing from the garbage bag and distributed across every available space in her backpack, which she had never in her life packed more carefully. She walked slowly on the steep sections, both hands holding the straps, the weight of $30,000 in silver in old paper pressing into her shoulders. The creek ran beside her the whole way, lower and quieter now in the flat morning light. No longer the murmuring voice she had heard on the walk-in, but something more austere, more matter-of-fact, as though it had said its piece the day before and was now simply going about its business. She hitched a ride from the Forest Service trailhead with a ranger in a green pickup who was heading toward Marshall and who looked at her. Once looked at the backpack she held on her lap rather than putting in the truck bed, and made a visible decision not to ask any of the questions that had clearly occurred to him. She thanked him at the courthouse square and walked 3 blocks to the Madison County Bank, which was a small institution in a brick building with a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising mortgage rates. And she went inside and opened an account. The teller was a woman named Sandra, who had the careful, pleasant neutrality of someone who had seen a range of human situations come through her window and had developed a professional policy of accepting them all equally. She processed the currency without comment. She called a manager when the coins required a different procedure, and the manager, a man in a short-sleeved dress shirt, came out and looked at the jars and looked at Lark and said, "You found these?" "Yes," Lark said. "Where?" "On property I own," she said. "In Madison County." He considered this. He considered the small girl in the thrift store coat, in the 12 mason jars full of silver. In whatever conclusion he came to, he kept to himself, which was the correct conclusion to keep to himself. "We'll need to count the currency," he said. "It may take a little while." "I'll wait," she said. She waited 2 hours, sitting in a wooden chair against the wall, her backpack on her lap, watching the February light move across the linoleum floor. When they were finished, the total came to $19,400 in currency. She left the silver coins to take to the dealer in Asheville at a later date when she understood their value better. She put $19,000 into the new account and kept $400 in cash, and she thanked Sandra and walked outside into the cold and stood on the sidewalk in Marshall, North Carolina, with the French Broad River visible at the end of the block and the mountains rising straight up behind the buildings on both sides, and she breathed. Then she got to work. She bought a 1997 Toyota Tacoma from a mechanic in Weaverville named Burkett, who had it sitting in the back of his lot with a for sale sign made from a piece of cardboard and a red marker. It had 204,000 miles on it and a rust spot on the passenger door and a crack in the left taillight held together with red cellophane tape. Burkett said the engine was solid and the frame was clean, and that he had personally serviced it for the previous owner for 11 years and knew exactly what it had and hadn't been through, which was more than you could say about most used trucks and most of the men who sold them. "How much?" Lark said. $2,800, he said. Firm. She bought it. Then she asked Burkett if he would show her how to change the oil herself. He looked at her for a moment in a way that most men of his generation looked at 18-year-old girls who asked them mechanical questions with a brief, involuntary surprise that he then visibly decided to set aside, filing her under a different heading than the one he had been about to use. He said, "You got 45 minutes." She had the time. She lay on a piece of cardboard under the Tacoma in the parking lot of Burkett's shop and changed the oil herself while Burkett stood beside the truck and narrated, pointing out the drain plug and the filter and the way to tell when the new oil was at the right level on the dipstick. She paid attention the way she paid attention to everything that mattered with her whole body, her hands learning the procedure at the same speed as her mind. And when she was done, she slid out from under the truck and stood up with oil on her forearms and on the knees of her jeans, and Burkett handed her a shop rag and looked at her with something that had become, over the course of 45 minutes, almost like respect. "Do it every 5,000 miles, he said. "Don't skip it. A truck like this will run till the sun burns out if you change the oil and don't run it hot. Neglect it and it'll quit on you halfway up a mountain in the rain. Your choice, which?" "I won't skip it," she said. She drove the Tacoma to the end of the Forest Service road and parked at the trailhead and hiked the 2 miles in with a load on her back. And for the first 2 weeks, that was her life down the trail. In the morning, drive to a supply store, load the truck, drive back 2 trips up the trail. A day with 40 pounds on her back each time, a tarp, tools, food, a sleeping bag, a camp stove, the basic apparatus of a person making a ruin into a place a person could live. She was small, but she was strong in the way that small people are sometimes strong, wiry, and stubborn, with the kind of strength that comes not from size, but from a refusal to stop. And the trail taught her the rest of it. The placement of feet and the distribution of weight, and which muscles could be trusted on the uphills, and which ones sent her warning signals that she decided to interpret as information rather than as instruction. The first month was the roof. She had known this before she started. The hierarchy of a damaged building is not complicated. Structure before everything, and water is the enemy of structure. Let the roof stay broken, and everything under it decays: the wood, the stone mortar, the iron fittings, the fabric of the thing itself. Fix the roof, and you buy time. Time is what you work with. Time is the material you are actually building in. She bought shingles and roofing felt at a building supply in Marshall, loaded them into the bed of the Tacoma, drove to the trailhead, and carried them in on her back. 50 pounds per load, 2 trips a day, 3 days the bundles bound to her pack frame with rope. The trail was 2 miles of uneven terrain that climbed several hundred feet in elevation, and 50 pounds on a small back over 2 miles of mountain trail is a different kind of 50 pounds than 50 pounds on a flat surface. She learned what it felt like. She learned to rest before she needed to, rather than after, to drink water before she was thirsty, to break the climb into sections and not think past the section she was in. On the 4th day, she climbed onto the roof. The western slope was the damaged section, a third of the surface bare to the sky. The old shingles stripped or fallen in the years of exposure. The rafters beneath gray and open and wet from recent rain. She spent the morning pulling off the remaining shingles that were loose or cracked or soft with rot, stacking them on the ground below. She found 2 rafters in the damaged section that had gone soft enough to flex under pressure, and she replaced them with new lumber she had cut to length and carried in piece by piece, fitting them between the sound rafters with the precision that the work required and the patience that she had always had, in quantities that exceeded what her life had so far demanded of her. She was on the upper section of the roof hammering a new rafter into place when the hammer slipped. It was a small thing. Her hand was cold. She had been working since sunrise and the temperature had not climbed above 38 degrees. The handle was damp and her grip was slightly wrong on the upswing, and the hammer came down at an angle instead of square. It bounced. Her hand followed it, and the edge of the rafter caught her left wrist at precisely the wrong moment, a sharp lateral stress that she felt before she heard anything and heard before she had processed what had happened. She sat very still on the roof for about 2 minutes. The pain came up through her arm and a slow swell peaked and settled into a steady throb that told her something was wrong, but did not tell her how wrong. She looked at the wrist. She flexed the fingers one at a time. They worked. The wrist did not want to bear weight, and there was a hot tightness building along the outside edge. But the fingers worked, which meant it was not broken, or not broken in a way that mattered yet. Then she finished nailing the rafter because she was up there, and the rafter was half done, and coming back up was harder than staying. She climbed down and assessed the wrist. It was swelling at the outside edge below the little finger, the kind of swelling that is not dramatic but is definitive, that tells you something has been compromised rather than broken outright. She wrapped it tight with a strip of cloth she tore from an old shirt she had brought for the purpose of having old fabric available, because old fabric is always useful, and she rested it that night with her arm propped on her rolled jacket. And in the morning it was worse before it was better, and then over the following days slowly better. She shingled the western slope over the next 4 days using her right hand as the primary and her left as the assistant, which was slower but workable. The first row was crooked, and she pulled it up and did it again. The second row was better. By the 5th row, she had found the rhythm nail slide overlap. Nail slide overlap, a pattern her right hand knew before her brain entirely understood it. The way the body learns the things it does, repeatedly, storing the knowledge in muscle and tendon rather than in thought. When the last shingle was down, she climbed off the roof and stood in the trail and looked up at the complete unbroken surface above the old stone walls, gray-brown in the late afternoon light, and she felt something that she had no precise word for. Not pride exactly, though it lived in the same neighborhood. Something more structural than pride. She had built a roof. She had built it with one working hand in February on a building 2 miles from the nearest road, and it was not a perfect roof, but it would keep the water out. And keeping the water out was what it was for, and nobody had helped her, and nobody could take it from her. It was nailed to the rafters permanent. Nobody could put it in a garbage bag and set it on a porch. Nobody could change a lock and shut her out of it. It was hers and it was real and it would be there in the morning. She sat on the creek bank and ate a sandwich and listened to the water, and that was the first night she slept in the upper room with a roof over her that she had made with her own hands. The second month was windows. She measured all 8 openings with a tape measure she had bought at the hardware store in Hot Springs, recording each dimension in a small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket alongside a pencil stub. The stone frames were precise and consistent, each opening cut to the same dimensions with only small variations in squareness. A quarter inch out of plumb, here an eighth inch there. The kind of variation that tells you the work was done by a skilled hand operating without machinery. A hand that tolerates imperfection, the way machine work does not, because it understands that nothing in nature is perfectly square, and the structure accommodates this rather than fighting it. She drove to Asheville and ordered glass from a hardware supplier on Merriman Avenue, the same street her mother had brought her home to from the hospital 18 years before a coincidence she noticed and set down without examining. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his 60s, with paint on his forearms, in the particular patience of someone who had answered many questions many times, and he cut 8 panes on a table saw, fitted with a glass blade, while she watched and showed her, without being asked, how to apply glazing compound with her thumb, pressing it into the channel around the edge of each pane in a continuous bead, and then smoothing it with a wetted finger. She drove back to the trailhead and carried the glass in 1 pane at a time, each wrapped in an old blanket and held flat against her chest with both arms, which meant walking the 2 miles one-armed in terms of balance, unable to use her arms for anything except holding the glass against her body the way you would carry a sleeping child. She moved slowly, placing each foot with attention, her eyes on the trail ahead for roots and wet stone. 8 separate trips, up and down, 8 panes, 8 miles each way, over the course of the project, all of it for glass. She was carrying something fragile. She adjusted to that the way she had spent her whole life adjusting to the fragility of things and people. When all 8 windows were set and glazed, and she stood in the upstairs room and looked through clean glass at the forest on all 4 sides, the room changed. The light that had been coming through open stone gaps now came through glass, and glass changes. Light in ways you only notice by comparison, giving it a quality of being contained, of being chosen, of belonging to the room, rather than merely passing through it. The forest outside looked more like itself, more precisely what it was, each branch and each evergreen needle held in sharper definition. The room felt sealed, like something that had been open to weather for 60 years had finally been closed again, made interior, made private, made hers. She built up the fireplace that same month. The chimney had 60 years of creosote on its inner walls, the black flammable residue of 1,000 fires that Silas had burned in the last decades the mill ran. She fashioned a brush from a wire coat hanger and an old chimney brush head she found at a salvage place in Marshall, taped to a length of conduit pipe she extended, with sections of wooden dowel rod, until the whole assembly reached from the firebox to the top of the chimney. She pushed it up from below, standing in the firebox, with her head below the damper, pushing and rotating the brush against the interior wall, while black flakes rained down on her, and the smell of old tar and old fire filled the room. She wore a bandana over her nose and mouth and goggles she had bought at the building supply, and she worked until the brush came down clean, which took most of an afternoon and left her black to the elbows. She lit a test fire of small sticks. The smoke rose straight up and disappeared into the chimney without hesitation, and she stood in front of the open damper and felt the draw on her face, a slight cool pull, as the column of air above her rose and took the smoke with it. The chimney worked. The fireplace worked. She understood that she had warmed the building in stages, first the roof, then the windows, then the heart of the thing, the fireplace that Silas Greer had built and fed and banked and built again for decades, the source of heat that had made the upstairs room livable through however many mountain winters had passed since 1871. She built a real fire that night and sat in front of it on the chestnut floor with her back against the wall and watched the flames and did not think about anything at all, which was a thing she had almost never been able to do. The third month was water and power and community, though she had not planned for the community part. The hand pump she installed herself, running a line of black polyethylene pipe down through the floor of the upper room, through the mill room below, and through the stone archway into the creek, securing the intake end to a rock on the creek floor with wire to keep it submerged at the point where the water ran clearest and the silt did not settle. Cold mountain water, gravity assisted but requiring effort to draw, always there, always clean tasting of the stone it had run over since long before anyone had bothered to taste it. She drank her first glass from the pump standing at the kitchen shelf she had built from a salvaged board and two iron brackets, and it tasted like altitude and cold and the mineral patience of deep stone, and she thought it was the best water she had ever had, and she was probably right. For power, she bought a small solar panel, 80 watts, and a deep cycle battery from a solar supplier in Asheville, who sold her both with a wiring diagram he sketched on the back of a receipt. She mounted the panel on the south-facing exterior wall above the roofline, ran the cables through a small hole she drilled through the stone with a masonry bit, and connected everything to the battery in the mill room below. Enough power for one LED bulb, a phone charger for a phone she rarely had service to use, and a small radio she found for $3 at a church thrift sale in Hot Springs. The radio received exactly one station, clearly a public broadcasting affiliate out of Asheville, that played classical music in the evenings and the morning news at 6. She listened to both. The classical music filled the upper room in the evenings in a way that the silence before it had not filled it. Not because she minded the silence, but because the music gave the silence a shape. And she learned that she preferred Brahms to most things and was indifferent to Vivaldi, and that the news delivered in the measured tones of a public radio announcer made the world outside the mountains feel both closer and less urgent, which was exactly what she needed it to do. The community came to her the way mountain communities have always come to their own, slowly, through side paths without announcement. Cutter Baines arrived on a Tuesday in late March, materializing at the mill from the trail with a 50-pound sack of seed corn on his shoulder, and no explanation for his presence. He was somewhere past 60, built like the mountain terrain itself, broad and unhurried, and fundamentally resistant to the idea that elevation was a difficulty. He had a gray beard that he kept trimmed with no particular attention to symmetry and eyes that took their time before they said anything. And he set the corn down on the ground outside the door and looked at the water wheel, and then at the roof, and then at the windows, taking inventory in the way of people who have spent their lives assessing the state of physical things. "You fixed the roof," he said. "Yes," Lark said. "Windows, too." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving over the work, finding the seams, the places where new met old, the standard of the craft. Then he said, "I knew Silas Greer. Not well. I was young and he was old, and the mill was already closed by the time I was old enough to bring grain up here myself. But my father brought corn. Said Silas could grind a bushel of cornmeal so fine you could make cake from it." He paused. "Said he never charged more than a share of what he ground. Said that was the old way, and he was an old man, and he wasn't about to change for anybody." He picked the sack of corn back up. "These are the old varieties. Cherokee white flour corn and bloody butcher. Been in my family 4 generations, kept back from the table every year for seed since before my granddad was born. You get that wheel working, I'll bring you corn to grind. We'll split the flour, your share for the grinding, and my share to take home. That was the arrangement with Silas, and it's the arrangement I'm offering you." He set the sack inside the door on the dry stone out of the weather. "I'll be back in the fall," he said, and walked back down the trail, and she watched him go and did not yet know his name. She learned it later from Odell Maynard, who came 3 weeks after Cutter, and who arrived in rubber boots and a canvas sun hat, carrying a jar of sourwood honey. Odell Maynard was 84 years old. She walked the 2 miles up the trail without pausing, without apparent effort, in rubber boots that had been repaired at the toe with a strip of electrical tape. And when she arrived at the mill, she stood in the trail for a long moment looking at the building with an expression that Lark could not immediately name, because it was not the kind of expression she had seen often in the people around her. It was the expression of someone seeing a thing that they had thought was gone and that turned out not to be gone after all. The particular quality of face that belongs to the unexpected recovery of something you had finished grieving and had to begin grieving all over again from the other direction. She was small herself, Odell Maynard smaller than she must once have been, the kind of small that accumulates over a long life of gravity and compression, but there was nothing diminished about her. She had the posture of someone who had made her decisions and stood by them, her back straight, despite everything that 84 years do to backs her chin, level her eyes moving over the mill with the attention of genuine knowledge. I grew up 3 miles down this creek, she said without preamble, as though she were continuing a conversation that had been on pause for 60 years. My mother used to send me up here with a sack on my back when I was 9, 10 years old. A sack of corn that weighed near as much as I did. I'd sit on that rock there. She pointed to a flat boulder on the near bank and wait while Silas ground it. He always gave me something. A biscuit usually, or a piece of cornbread wrapped in a cloth napkin he made me promise to bring back. He'd send me back down the trail with the flour and the food and tell me to watch my feet on the root section. The same root section, it's still there. I watched my feet on it coming up just now. She held out the honey jar. Sour wood, she said, from my own hives. I thought someone who was putting the effort into coming up here deserved something sweet. Lark took the jar. It was heavier than it looked, the comb visible inside the honey, the dark amber of sour wood, which only blooms a few weeks a year, and only in these mountains, in which people drive hundreds of miles to buy. Odell walked to the millroom door and looked inside at the grinding stones and the collapsed gearing mechanism and stood for a while without speaking, her eyes moving from the stones to the axle connection point to the window that faced the water wheel outside. She was not inspecting it. She was remembering it. There is a difference, and it was visible on her face, the difference between a person reading a map and a person looking at the place the map describes. Can you fix the wheel? She asked. I'm working on it, Lark said. Odell nodded as though this confirmed something she had already decided. Then she said without particular emphasis, in the tone of someone laying down a single card and watching to see what it draws. Silas had a daughter, Clara. Something happened to her sometime in the early 50s. I don't know exactly. No one in the valley ever knew exactly. Just that one year she was here, a little thing younger than I was, and then there came a year she wasn't, when she shouldn't have been old enough to be gone yet. And after that, Silas ran the mill alone until he died. He never talked about it, not to anyone I ever knew. He just kept grinding, and he got quieter every year, and then he was gone. She paused. It was a sad thing. A whole valley felt it, and nobody said it out loud because that's how we are up here. We feel things at each other instead of saying them. She left the way she came, the rubber boots steady on the trail, the canvas hat tilting slightly in the wind off the creek, and Lark stood in the doorway and held the jar of sourwood honey and thought about a daughter named Clara, who had been here and then was not, and about a letter under the floorboards with that same name written on the back in a hand that shook. Lark fixed the water wheel. It took 3 weeks, and it was the hardest thing she did. The paddles first. 3 were missing, entirely pulled free by years of ice and current and the slow mechanical failure of the wheel's own weight pressing against degraded wood. 1 hung at an angle, still attached at one end, the wood soft and dark, where water had gotten into the grain at the attachment point. She felled a white oak on the hillside above the mill, choosing a straight section of trunk with tight growth rings, the rings tight because the tree had grown slowly in poor mountain soil, which made the wood dense and strong. She split it with a froe and a mallet into rough paddle blanks, each one slightly oversized, which she then shaped with a draw knife on a shaving horse. She rigged from 2 sawhorses and a brace of wood sitting astride it, and pulling the draw knife toward her body the way the tool was designed to be used, feeling the thin curls of white oak peel away from the surface and fall to the ground around her boots. She shaped 4 paddles, 1 to replace the broken one, and 3 to fill the gaps. She fitted them to the wheel frame with wooden pegs driven into pre-bored holes, the pegs slightly oversized for the holes, so they had to be driven home with a mallet and would not pull free. She replaced the cracked axle with a length of locust wood she had selected from a standing tree on the upper bank. Locust because locust is the hardest, densest, most rot-resistant wood in the southern Appalachian forest. The wood that fence posts are made of, the wood that outlasts the iron nails that were once driven into it. The wood that Silas himself would have chosen if Silas had needed an axle, which she felt certain he would have. To turn the locust log into an axle, she built a lathe. She had never built a lathe. She studied the problem for 2 days, thinking about it while she worked on other things, letting it arrange itself in the back of her mind, the way problems do when you give them time rather than forcing them. The principle was simple. You needed to spin the workpiece and bring a cutting tool against the surface while it turned. She rigged the spinning from the truck's spare tire, mounted on a stand, at the correct height driven by a belt she fashioned from an old extension cord attached to the drill motor, in a way that transferred rotation to the tire and the tire to the workpiece through a friction arrangement she adjusted with a wooden wedge. It was not elegant. It rattled and it slipped, and she had to stop and reset it a dozen times. It worked. She turned the locust axle over 2 days, bringing it down to a cylinder of consistent diameter with a hand chisel held against the spinning wood, the chips and shavings flying past her face, the smell of fresh-cut locust, sharp and green and faintly sweet, filling the air around the mill door. She fitted the axle to the wheel, hung the wheel on its iron mounting brackets, the same brackets Silas's grandfather had forged in 1871. Still sound, still doing their work, and reconnected the interior gearing mechanism with new wooden gear teeth she had carved and fitted individually into the wheel frames. Each tooth a small, precise object that had to mesh with its neighbor exactly, or the whole mechanism would bind. The day she opened the sluice gate, she did it alone. The gate was a simple plank mechanism set in the stone channel above the wheel, held shut for 60 years by its own weight and the accumulated debris of the creek pressing against it. She had cleared the channel the day before, removing the leaves and silt and small branches that had built up against the gate face over the decades, working in the cold water with her sleeves rolled up and her arms going numb. Now she lifted the gate handle and pulled. The water came through the channel and hit the first paddle. The wheel moved. A single degree of rotation so slow it was barely visible, the white oak paddle catching the falling water and beginning under its weight to descend. Then the next paddle caught the water and the motion continued. The wheel groaned. It was a sound that came from deep in the wood, and the iron fittings a long, low protest against motion after 60 years of stillness, the sound a sleeping thing makes when it is woken. Then the second rotation began before the first was finished. Then the third, faster, the groaning settling into a steady, rhythmic creak, the wheel finding the pace the creek wanted to give it. The grinding stones began to move. She heard them before she felt them, a low circular friction coming up through the stone floor. Then the vibration reached her feet and worked its way up through her legs and into her chest, settling there like a second heartbeat. The stones were turning. The upper stone on the lower stone, the runner on the bed stone, exactly as Silas Greer's grandfather had designed in 1871, exactly as Silas himself had watched 10,000 times over decades of mornings. The mill was running. She stood in the doorway between the mill room and the trail and watched the wheel turn and felt the stones moving beneath her feet and understood something that she could not have understood before this moment, because this was the kind of understanding that is only available to people who have done a specific thing and not to people who have merely thought about it. She understood what it meant to make a dead thing live again. Not to imagine it, not to want it, but to do it with your hands and your back. In 3 weeks of cold work, to take a thing that grown men with machinery had declared beyond saving, and to save it anyway, quietly alone 2 miles up a creek with a wrist that still ached when the weather turned. The condemnation notice arrived on a morning in early April. She found it on her way up the trail, stapled to the large tulip poplar at the point where the Forest Service trail began. A yellow sheet of paper in a plastic sleeve, the plastic already slightly clouded from the previous night's dew. She stopped and read it in the trail. Madison County Notice of Condemnation. Property identified as tax parcel 9-0432, Beckett Creek Road, Hot Springs Township. Structure on said property has been deemed unsafe for habitation pursuant to Madison County Code Section 14-112. Owner of record required to demonstrate active habitation and structural remediation within 60 days or county will exercise right of demolition. Failure to respond will result in forfeiture of property rights under North Carolina General Statute 160A-426. She read it twice. The cold of it went through her in a way the February air never had the cold of officialdom of a system that did not know she existed and did not care, that had a form and a code section and a statute number for taking a thing away from a person, the same machinery in a different uniform as a changed lock in a garbage bag on a porch. She took it off the tree and folded it and put it in her jacket pocket and walked the 2 miles to the mill and sat on the creek bank and thought carefully about what it meant and what it required. What it meant was that the county had not updated its records. The tax sale had been processed by the clerk's office, but the information had not made it to the Code Enforcement Division, which still had the property listed under whatever name or status it had carried for the past decades of vacancy. They thought they were sending a notice to no one to an empty ruin, the last legal step before sending a contractor who would once again look at the trail and turn around. They did not know that someone had bought it. They did not know that someone had carried glass 2 miles on her chest and turned a locust axle on a lathe made from a truck tire. What it required was that she go to Marshall in person with documentation and establish herself as the legal owner who was actively inhabiting and repairing the structure. She had not been to an official building except to buy the mill and to open the bank account in her life. She had never needed to argue for anything in an official setting. The thought of standing in front of a desk and defending herself of being looked at and assessed and possibly disbelieved by a person with the power to take her home was the most frightening thing she had faced since the day she found the garbage bag. More frightening in its way, because the garbage bag had only required her to leave, and this required her to fight. But she thought about the roof she had built with a sprained wrist. She thought about the axle she had turned on a lathe she had built from a spare tire and a drill. She thought about 12 mason jars on a chestnut floor. She had done hard things. This was another hard thing. She walked back down the trail, drove the Tacoma to Marshall, and walked into the county offices. The code enforcement officer was a man named Purvis, who had the weary, faintly apologetic manner of someone who enforced rules he had not made and whose enforcement he was sometimes embarrassed by. He was in his 40s, slightly overweight, with reading glasses on a lanyard, and a desk covered in stacked folders, each folder a small bureaucratic tragedy in waiting. Lark set the purchase documentation from the tax sale on his desk. She set the bank account statement showing the deposit dated days after the purchase. She set a dated photograph of the interior showing the new roof shingles through the upper window. One of 3 photographs she had taken with a disposable camera she had bought in Hot Springs for this exact contingency because she had understood on some level that a day like this might come and that she would need to prove with paper what she had done with her hands. She set her signed statement of habitation, which she had written by hand on a piece of notebook paper the evening before, describing the improvements made to date and the schedule of further work in her small, neat handwriting. Purvis picked up each document. He read the statement. He looked at the photograph for a long time. "You're living up there," he said. "Yes," Lark said. "You're 18 years old." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, turning the photograph in his hands. "The trail's not maintained past the Forest Service turnaround." "I know that," she said. "I walk it twice a day most days with what I need on my back." He set down the photograph and looked at her over his reading glasses with an expression that combined professional assessment with something more personal, some involuntary recognition of the gap between what this situation appeared to be on paper and what it apparently was in fact the gap between a condemned ruin and a girl who had re-roofed it alone. "I'll need to make a site visit," he said, but his tone had changed, the tone of a man no longer looking for a reason to demolish, but looking for a reason not to. "Verify habitation. It's required. I can't waive it." When? She asked. 2 weeks, he said. Come on a morning, she said. The wheel runs better in the morning when the creek's up from the night. Something crossed his face, a small surprise pleasure. The pleasure of a man who deals in ruins being told that one of them runs. The wheel runs, he said. It runs, she said. Come see. She drove back to the mill. Blythe had come along for the drive to Marshall, waiting in the Tacoma at the trailhead, a silent and solid presence in the passenger seat, who said nothing during the drive and nothing after, and who, when Lark came back out of the county office, was sitting with a thermos of coffee and 2 cups on the hood of the truck. They sat on the hood of the truck in the parking lot of the Madison County Administrative Building and drank coffee in the April morning and did not discuss what had happened inside. They did not need to. Blythe had not offered to come in. She had understood that this was a thing Lark needed to do standing alone in front of the desk, and that the help Blythe could give was the help of waiting in the truck with coffee ready near, but not in front. It was the kind of help that knows its place, which is the rarest kind. Purvis came on a morning 2 weeks later, hiked the 2 miles in a pair of boots that had clearly been bought for the occasion, and stood in the mill room with his hand on the doorframe and watched the wheel turn and the stones grind. And he did not say much, but he wrote in his report, which Lark received a copy of by mail at Blythe's address 3 weeks after that the structure was occupied, sound, and actively maintained, and that the condemnation order was withdrawn. He had added at the bottom in a hand that was not the official typeface, but his own pen, a single line that was not required by any code or statute. A remarkable piece of work. Reed Conover arrived at the trailhead on a Saturday in mid-May. He drove a new Lexus SUV black, and he was wearing clean khakis and leather hiking boots that had never been on a trail, the leather still stiff and unscuffed. He was perhaps 50, lean and composed in the manner of men who have been successful for long enough that composure has become involuntary, and he held himself with the specific ease of someone who is accustomed to being the most financially significant person in any given conversation, an ease that did not so much enter a room as occupy it. He had a business card. He gave it to Lark with both hands, which was a gesture she recognized from a magazine article about business customs she had read in the waiting room of a dentist's office 3 years before. A gesture meant to convey respect, and that conveyed to her mostly that he had learned it from a magazine too. His card said Reed Conover, VAVP Development, Blue Ridge Heritage Properties, Asheville, NC. I've been following the tax parcel records, he said pleasantly. Your purchase came up in our monitoring system. We've been interested in this property for some time longer than you've owned it. He paused, letting her absorb that the interest predated her, that she had stepped into the middle of a story already in progress. We're developing a portfolio of heritage destinations in the western North Carolina region. Working grist mills are extraordinarily rare. People will drive 3 hours and pay $40 to watch one turn. They draw significant visitor interest, gift shops, tours, a bed and breakfast component. We've commissioned a study. He said the number with the practiced neutrality of someone who knows the number is large and wants you to know he knows it. $180,000, he said. Cash, 30-day close, no contingencies. You'd walk away with more money than you'd know what to do with, and we'd take the burden of this place off your hands. She looked at him. She thought about the number. She let herself think about it clearly and honestly without flinching from what it was, which was more money than anyone in her family had ever had, more money than Vera had earned in any 5-year stretch of her adult life, more money than Silas Greer had saved in nearly 40 years of grinding corn. She thought about what you could do with $180,000 when you were 18 years old with a garbage bag of clothes. You could buy a house with a lock that no one could change. You could go to college the way her mother almost had. You could be, for the first time in your life, financially safe, which was a kind of safety she had never once tasted and had wanted with a hunger that had shaped her since she was old enough to want anything. And then she thought about Cutter Baines and his 4-generation seed corn sitting in a sack inside her door. She thought about Odell Maynard standing in the mill room with her hand on the grinding stone, not inspecting it but remembering it. her eyes wet with a thing 60 years deep. She thought about the sound of the wheel turning, for the first time in 60 years, felt through the stone floor of a building that Silas Greer's grandfather had built in 1871 with stones he cut from this creek bed. She thought about the words on the back of the letter, "Clara, my girl, the mill is yours. I built every stone of it for you," and about the fact that this man in his unscuffed boots wanted to turn that into a gift shop. "No," she said. Reed Conover received this with the equanimity of someone who expected it and had prepared for it. He nodded once, put his hands in his pockets. "The offer stands," he said. "People in your situation sometimes find their position changes. A long winter, an injury way out here 2 miles from a road. The realities of a place like this have a way of asserting themselves." He said it without malice, which was almost more offensive than if he had said it with malice, because it meant he was not even trying to threaten her, only informing her, simply reporting what he considered a fact about the trajectory of situations like hers, the way you might tell someone it was going to rain. "Okay," she said. He gave her a second business card, held it out with two hands again, and she took it, because refusing it would have been a gesture, and she did not have time for gestures. He got in the Lexus and drove back toward Asheville on the gravel road, a thin trail of dust rising behind the SUV and drifting east in the morning air. She put the card in her jacket pocket, and later at the mill she put it on the mantel above the fireplace. Not because she valued it, but because she wanted to remember that the offer had been made and that she had said no, that there was a number large enough to buy almost anyone, and she had heard it and turned and walked back up the trail. She walked back up the trail. She found the hidden space on a Thursday in early June, 6 weeks after the wheel had started turning. She had been working on the gearing mechanism, trying to improve the connection between the wheel axle and the upper millstone by tightening a section of the iron shaft that ran through the exterior wall at the base of the wheel mounting. The connection point was in the lower corner of the millroom wall, where the interior wall met the floor, and she had been chipping at a section of deteriorated pointing around the shaft fitting with a cold chisel to reseat it properly when the chisel went further into the wall than it should have, sliding past where solid stone should have been into a softer give. She stopped. She tapped with the chisel handle along the wall, listening the way she listened to everything. The stone in that section sounded different from the surrounding wall, not hollow exactly, but less solid. A difference in resonance that spoke of a void behind the face stone, a deliberate emptiness in a wall that should have been solid all the way through. She worked carefully for about an hour, removing the facing stones one at a time, finding that they had been set without mortar specifically to be removable. The whole section designed as a concealed access, each stone numbered on its back face in faded pencil, so that whoever knew the sequence could take them out and put them back and leave no sign. Silas had built 2 hiding places into this mill, one under the floor for his money found by anyone who noticed a loose board, and one in the wall deeper, harder, for something he wanted hidden from even the kind of person who would notice a loose board. The space behind was roughly the size of a shoebox, cool and dry, protected by the 2-foot thickness of the wall from moisture and temperature change. She reached inside. She found a canvas envelope, oilcloth stiff with age, folded clothes, and held with a wax cord. She set it on the floor of the mill room and opened it with care, her hands steady, the wheel turning behind her, the stones grinding above. Inside was a photograph, black and white, printed on heavy photographic paper with a slight curve to it from decades in the same position. 2 people, a man and a girl. The man was somewhere in his 50s, lean and angular, standing with the posture of someone who worked outdoors his whole life. He was not looking at the camera, but slightly past it, in the way of men of that generation who were not entirely comfortable being photographed, who regarded the camera as a kind of mild imposition to be endured. The girl was perhaps 8 years old. She stood beside the man with one hand in his, her other hand raised slightly, pointing at something outside the frame of the photograph. Her face turned toward where she was pointing so that what you saw was her profile and the back of her hair, and the eager motion of her arm, a child caught in the act of showing her father something. Look at that, the most ordinary and the most heartbreaking gesture in the world. On the back of the photograph in pencil, Silas and Clara, 1947, Lark held the photograph in both hands. Behind the photograph was a folded sheet of paper, different from Silas's letter thinner, more official in its format, the language typed rather than handwritten. It was a form of some kind worn soft at the folds, the type slightly faded but legible. She read it. It was a record of transfer, not a legal document in any formal sense, but a record nonetheless, the kind of document created by an institution to track the movement of persons in its care. The institution was the Holston Children's Home, Knoxville, Tennessee. The date was March 14, 1952. The child's name was listed as Clara Ann Greer, female, age 13. The section for guardian or responsible party listed Silas Greer, Father Beckett, Creek Road, Madison County, North Carolina. Unable to maintain custody due to financial hardship following flood damage 1951 season. She read it again. Clara had not left. She had been sent. Silas had not abandoned his daughter. He had lost his harvest in the 1951 flood. She would later learn from Odell that the flood of 1951 had been catastrophic in the Madison County watershed, washing out crops and bottomland farms throughout the French Broad Valley, drowning livestock, taking houses off their foundations, and carrying them downstream. And without a harvest, there had been no grain to mill. And without grain to mill, there had been nothing to grind and nothing to trade. And a man alone in the mountains in 1951, a widower, she guessed. Since there was no mother anywhere in the story, a man alone with a 13-year-old daughter and nothing coming in until spring. And maybe not then, was a man facing choices that no person should have to face, but that people have always faced and made, in the dark alone, choosing the least unbearable of several unbearable things. He had sent Clara to Knoxville, to a children's home where she would be fed and sheltered and kept warm through a winter he could not keep her warm through himself. He had spent the next 6 years grinding grain and saving money and putting it in mason jars under the floor of the upper room, sending what he could afford to the children's home, the money orders Jessie would later tell her about waiting. Growing old, writing a letter in April of 1958, in case he did not live long enough to give the mill to Claire himself, building 2 hiding places, one for the money and one for the proof of what he had done, and why the photograph in the transfer paper, the evidence that he had not thrown his daughter away, but had given her up to keep her alive, and had meant the whole time to get her back. He had died in 1962. He had died without getting her back. Lark sat on the stone floor of the mill room with the photograph of Silas and Clara Greer in her hands and listened to the water wheel turning outside its paddles, catching the water in the sluice and releasing it in arcs. The grinding stones above her head rotating with the low circular murmur she had come to know. The way you come to know a sound you live inside of the sound of the creek rising through the stone beneath her. He had saved for nearly 40 years to give his daughter a mill. He had never gotten the chance. She understood that kind of saving. She understood saving for a future you are not sure you will reach in a sock in a mason jar against a day that someone else might prevent from ever coming. She had $214 in a sock once, and a lock got changed before she could use it. He had $30,000 in jars, and he died before his daughter could come up the trail. She set the photograph very carefully on the flat surface of the lower millstone and placed the transfer document beside it, and she sat for a long time in the working mill and thought about what she held and what it meant and what, if anything, she could do about it. Outside the wheel turned. The creek ran. The June light moved across the stone walls and the iron fittings and the 2 round stones that had been grinding grain in this valley since before any living person could remember. The question of Clara Greer, wherever she had gone, whatever had become of her after Knoxville, after childhood, after all the years since 1952, that question had been sitting behind a stone wall in this mill room for more than 60 years. It was sitting in her hands now, and she found that she could not put it down. The flour sold out every week. Blythe put it on the counter at Flour and Stone on Thursday mornings in brown paper bags that Lark had folded and filled and sealed with a strip of masking tape at the mill the evening before, each one labeled in her own handwriting with a black marker. Greer Mill Stone ground cornmeal and Greer Mill Stone ground. Wheat flour and the date of grinding. $6 a pound for the cornmeal, $8 for the wheat. By Thursday afternoon, the shelf was empty. By Friday morning, Blythe had a waiting list that she kept in a spiral notebook behind the counter, 3 pages of names and phone numbers that grew through the summer like the creek grew after rain. The flour tasted like something. That was the thing people said when they tried to explain it to people who had not tried it yet. And it was the thing those people said in turn when they tried to explain it after that, because it was both accurate and insufficient as a description. It tasted like something. It tasted like the grain it came from, which sounds obvious, but which is not obvious to anyone who has eaten only commercial flour. Flour that has been processed and bleached and stripped of the germ and the bran and all the parts of the grain that contain flavor and nutrition, leaving behind a white powder that is structurally useful for baking, but which has had its identity removed along with everything else. Stone ground flour ground on stones that ran cool, the friction kept low by the creek-driven pace of the wheel. The grain never overheated, the oils in the germ never scorched. This flour tasted like corn. It tasted like wheat. It tasted like the specific variety of Cherokee white flour corn that Cutter Baines had grown from seed his great-grandmother had kept back from the table every autumn for 100 years, which tasted like nothing else in the world, like the memory of a thing people did not know they had forgotten. Blythe called her on the payphone at the Hot Springs gas station on a Friday evening in late July. "I need more," she said. "I know," Lark said. "People are asking if you do mail order. I've got a woman in Charlotte wants to send it to her daughter in Oregon." "I don't have an address," Lark said. "I don't have a mailbox. I don't have a road." There was a pause. "Use mine," Blythe said. "I'll handle the shipping out of the shop. We split it 60-40 your favor." Lark thought about it for a moment. 65-35, she said. Another pause. Then Blythe said with what Lark recognized as the sound of genuine satisfaction, the satisfaction of a woman who had spent her whole life watching small, quiet people get taken advantage of and was pleased beyond measure to see one of them negotiate deal. She was running the mill 6 days a week by August. Cutter brought grain his own Cherokee white and the bloody butcher dent corn plus soft red winter wheat from 2 other farms in the valley that he had apparently recruited into the arrangement during some quiet period when Lark had not been watching. He carried it up in 50-pound sacks with the unhurried steadiness of a man to whom 50 pounds and 2 miles were not a calculation, but simply a fact of the morning. He never announced his arrivals. He appeared and set the sacks by the door and accepted a cup of coffee from the wood stove and drank it, standing on the trail, looking at the water wheel, and occasionally said something that was worth the silence that preceded it. Once in September, he stood at the wheel for a long time without speaking and then said, "My daddy brought 100 pounds of corn up here in the spring of 1958. Silas had just turned it over the last grinding of the season. My daddy said the flour came back in a week and it was the finest grinding he'd ever seen. Said he could make biscuits as light as cloud with it." He drank from the cup. He said Silas seemed distracted that day, kept stopping work to look down the trail. My daddy thought he was waiting on somebody. Lark did not say anything. "Spring of 1958, Cutter said. That was the last year the mill ran." He finished the coffee and set the cup on the flat stone beside the door and picked up the empty sacks and walked back down the trail, and she stood and thought about it for a long time afterward. April 1958. Silas had written the letter in April of 1958. He had been looking down the trail in the spring of 1958, grinding his last season of grain, hiding his life savings under the floorboards, and the proof of his love behind the wall for a daughter who had been gone for 6 years. Waiting. Still waiting, even then decades into running a mill grinding corn for a valley full of people who depended on him, while his own life sat in mason jars under the floor, and his daughter was somewhere in Knoxville and the trail stayed empty. She understood that kind of waiting. She had done a version of it herself in a different building under different conditions for years. The waiting that is really hoping. The hoping you cannot afford to name because naming it would make its failure unbearable. Odell Maynard came every 2 weeks through the summer and into the fall, arriving always from the trail, always in rubber boots, in the canvas hat, always carrying something. Honey in various manifestations, comb honey and creamed honey, and honey infused with dried ginger from her garden. A jar of pickled ramps she had made in the spring, a bag of dried apples from a tree that her grandmother had planted. Once a pair of wool socks she had knitted herself from the wool of a neighbor's sheep, the wool natural brown without dyeing warm in a way that had nothing to do with thickness. She never called ahead. There was no way to call ahead. She appeared and her appearances became one of the structures of Lark's weeks, as reliable as the creek and more anticipated than most things. And they sat on the flat creekside rock together and drank coffee and talked. Or more precisely, Odell talked and Lark listened, which was an arrangement that suited both of them and that neither ever proposed formally. Odell knew this valley the way people know places they have never left, with the total comprehensive knowledge of someone who has watched every square foot of it across 8 decades. She knew which section of the trail flooded first in heavy rain and which held dry. She knew where a family of otters had lived in the creek bank in the 1970s and where the herons nested in the sycamores below the mill. She knew the genealogy of every farm in the watershed going back 4 generations, who had sold to whom and under what circumstances, and whether it had been a good decision. She knew the names of trees, not the book names, but the names people up here used: sarvis and ironwood, and the old names for the laurel. In October, sitting on the flat rock with the maples going red across the creek, she said, "I've been thinking about what you told me, about Clara." Lark waited. "The children's home in Knoxville. Holston." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "My cousin Edith worked in Knoxville for a while in the 60s at a hospital near there. I remember her saying once years ago that there was a woman at the Holston home, a girl who had grown up there, and then stayed on as staff after she aged out instead of leaving. Edith thought it was strange. She said the girl wouldn't leave, like she was waiting for somebody to come get her, and couldn't bring herself to move on with her life until they did. I never connected it to Silas. Never knew the whole story, then none of us did." She paused. "But it fits the time. And it fits a child who'd been told her daddy was coming back." She looked at the water. If that girl was Clara and she stayed in Knoxville, she might have made a life there, might have had a family. She put the cup down on the rock. "The question is whether anybody in that family knows this place exists, whether they know an old man in the mountains saved his whole life for a girl and wrote her name on a letter and put it under a floor." Lark looked at the mill behind them, the water wheel turning in the October light, steady and constant, its new white oak paddle still pale against the older wood of the frame, the stone walls silver green with lichen, the 8 windows reflecting the burning forest. "I've been thinking about that too," she said. The first snow came in early December. It arrived overnight, a quiet accumulation that she heard the beginning of before she slept, the particular silence that precedes snow in a mountain forest, a held breath, a cessation of the small sounds that normally populate the night. She woke to find the world outside the 8 windows transformed the forest floor white and unbroken. The creek banks edged with snow that hung over the water in thin projecting shelves. Gravity and surface tension in long, slow negotiation. The water wheel dusted on its upper arc, each paddle holding a small, precise ridge of white on its top edge. She built the fire up and stood at the south window with her coffee and looked at it. She had never lived inside a winter before. She had lived through winters in the house in Asheville, inside walls that kept the weather theoretical, passing through it in a car or under an umbrella, arriving somewhere warm before the cold became real. Here the winter was not theoretical, it was structural. It was the medium she moved through and in and against, and it had qualities she was learning the way she had learned the trail and the wheel and the stones by daily exposure, until the knowledge became physical and then became automatic and then became hers. The stone walls, 2 feet thick, were slow to respond to temperature change in either direction. They absorbed the cold gradually and gave it up gradually, so the interior temperature of the mill fluctuated less than the exterior by 30 degrees or more. On nights when the outside dropped to single digits, the upstairs room stayed in the low 40s without the fire. With the fire, the room was warm enough to read in a shirt. She burned oak and hickory that she had spent October splitting and stacking under a tarp on the south side of the building rounds. She had bucked from a blowdown on the hillside above the mill, the wood already seasoned by its years on the ground. She learned to bank the fire at night and feed it at first light to keep a cast iron pot of water on the stove surface at all times for humidity and for the tea and the cooking water and the washing water to sleep with her boots near the stove rather than across the room. The creak never stopped. That was the thing she returned to in the deep of winter, in the nights when the temperature outside dropped past what felt survivable, and the fire had burned low, and she lay in the bed she had built from locust posts and chestnut planks under 2 wool blankets and a down sleeping bag. She listened, and the creek was always there. Even under ice, even when its surface froze solid in the narrow sections, and the ice extended partway across the main channel, in thin plates that caught the moonlight. Even then, she could hear the water moving underneath a muffled lower sound. The water's voice thickened by the ice above it, but present, always present, doing what water does, which is to keep moving because there is no other option and no option is required. She had been made small for a long time, small and quiet and overlooked and managed and measured against someone else's requirements and found insufficient. She was beginning to understand that first winter, what Silas had understood, what his grandfather had understood when he chose this particular bend of creek in this particular hollow and built a building that turned grain into flour, that the measure of a thing is not its size but its usefulness, that the creek beside her was narrow enough to jump across in most places and had been shaping the valley it ran through since before anyone thought to measure it. That small things, patient things, things that keep going. When the only reason to keep going is that stopping is not in their nature, those things change the world quietly without announcing it by the simple accumulation of days. The creek did not fight. It did not push. It found the path of least resistance, and it followed it. And over years and decades and centuries, it carved a valley out of solid rock. That was a thing she meant to remember. That was a thing she meant to become. She was coming back up the trail on a Thursday afternoon in late January, deep in that first winter, her backpack loaded with supplies from the hardware store in Hot Springs when she saw the car. It was parked at the Forest Service turnaround, a 10-year-old Honda Civic, the color of old pewter, one hubcap missing on the driver's side, a small dent in the rear quarter panel that had been there long enough to have gathered road dust in its creases. She knew the car. She had known it for 10 years without ever thinking about it consciously, the way you know certain things that are simply part of the fixed furniture of your life. The sound of a specific floorboard, the angle of a particular street lamp, the car parked in a driveway that belongs to a house you grew up in. She stopped on the trail at the edge of the Forest Service road. Vera Holloway was standing beside the car. She was thinner than she had been, not dramatically, but in the way that a year of sustained stress reduces a person taking something from the face and the posture and the soft places around the eyes. She was wearing a winter coat that Lark recognized, a gray wool coat she had owned for years, and her hands were in her pockets, and she was looking at the trailhead sign, not at Lark, as though she had been studying it for some time and had not yet decided what to do about it, as though the sign held some instruction she was trying to read. Lark stood at the edge of the road and looked at her. Her mother looked up. For a moment, neither of them moved or spoke. The late afternoon light came through the bare trees at a low angle. The January light that is more horizontal than vertical, that makes shadows very long and makes everything look like it is near the end of something. The creek could be heard faintly from here 2 miles upstream, a distant murmur behind the wind in the bare branches. Vera said, "I left him." Lark said nothing. "In September," Vera said. "I've been staying with my cousin in Waynesville. I've been..." She stopped and started again the way people do when the rehearsed version of a speech meets the actual person it was rehearsed for and falls apart. I went back to work. There's a vet clinic in Waynesville on Champion Drive. They needed a tech. I'm a tech again, after all these years. She said it like a confession and like a small, impossible pride both at once. I'm good at it. I'd forgotten I was good at something. She was not asking for anything yet. Lark could see that she was being careful not to ask for anything, that she had made some internal decision before she got in the car and drove here, that she would not ask, that she would only offer what she had, which was her presence and her history and the brute physical fact that she had gotten in a car and driven 2.5 hours and parked at the edge of a national forest and walked the last bit of gravel and stood in the cold for an hour beside a sign because she did not know what else to do and could not think of anything to do but be there. It's cold, Lark said. How long have you been standing here? About an hour, Vera said. Lark looked at her for a moment longer. The January light, the pewter Civic with the missing hubcap, her mother's hands in the pockets of the gray coat, her face carrying all the years of the house in Asheville, like a weather map carries the record of past systems, the storms and the calms, and the long gray stretches in between. It's 2 miles, Lark said. The trail's icy in the shaded sections. Watch your feet. She turned and walked into the forest. She did not look back to see if Vera followed, because the looking back was not something she was ready to do yet, because to look back would be to offer something she had not decided to offer and could not yet take back if she changed her mind. She listened, and after a moment, she heard the sound of footsteps on the packed snow behind her. Tentative at first on the uneven ground, and then steadier as her mother found the rhythm of the trail. The rhythm Lark herself had found in the first weeks, the placement of feet, the reading of the ground. They walked the 2 miles without speaking, the daughter ahead and the mother behind the creek, running beside them the whole way, telling its truth over and over, having nothing to hide. When they came around the bend and the mill appeared, Vera stopped. Lark walked onto the door and set her backpack against the outside wall and turned. Vera was standing in the trail looking at the mill at the water wheel, turning in the late light, the pale new paddles in the dark old frame, the water catching and releasing in arcs at the stone walls, in the 8 windows, in the thin thread of smoke rising from the chimney into the cold blue dusk at the creek bank, in the flat rock where Lark sat in the evenings, and the grinding stones visible through the open millroom door. Her face was doing something complicated, the face of a woman seeing what her daughter had made out of nothing, out of $10 and a garbage bag in a single year alone. He built this, she said, the man who owned it. His grandfather, Lark said, in 1871. He left it to his father left it to him. Vera was quiet. Then in a voice that was not quite steady, it's standing. Yes, Lark said. Come inside. That night, for the first time in more than a year, Lark slept in the same building as her mother. They had not resolved anything. There was too much between them that was real, and too little time that had passed. And forgiveness, the actual thing, not the performance of it, but the structural fact of it, takes longer than one night on either side, longer than one winter, longer maybe than either of them had. But the snow that had been threatening since mid-afternoon began in earnest around 10. Heavy and windless, the flakes coming down fat and slow in the light from the one window she lit, and the temperature outside dropped past the point where sending someone back down an icy trail in the dark to a car parked 2 miles away in a national forest in a January snowstorm was something Lark was willing to do regardless of the unfinished conversation between them. There were some things you did not do to a person, even a person who had failed you. There were some things you did not become, even to someone who had let you be made small. Lark had decided somewhere on the walk up the trail that she was not going to be a locked door. Whatever else she became, she was not going to be that. She gave Vera the spare blankets. She banked the fire and fed it at midnight and fed it again at 4. She lay in her bed and listened to the creak in her mother's breathing, a sound she had not heard in over a year, a sound from childhood in the snow falling on the roof she had built with a sprained wrist, in a February that felt like a long time ago, and was not, in fact, a long time ago at all, was less than a year ago, though it felt like it belonged to a different person's life. In the morning, Vera got up before Lark and built the fire. Lark came down the narrow stair to find it already going, the kettle already on. Her mother standing at the south window, watching the snow-covered forest, with the particular stillness of someone who has not been still in a long time, who has been bracing for so long that stillness feels foreign. There was coffee. There were 2 cups. They sat on opposite sides of the small table and drank it, and the wheel turned outside in the white morning, half buried in snow, but turning still, the creek keeping it going the way the creek kept everything going. "I want to help," Vera said, "with the mill, with whatever needs doing. I'm not asking to stay. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know better than to ask that. I'm just saying that I know how to work, and I know how to be useful, and if there's something here that needs doing that I can do, I'd like to do it. For its own sake. For no reason." Lark held her cup in both hands, feeling the heat of it move into her fingers. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not going to pretend the last 12 years didn't happen because you're sad now and you left him now. You watched. For years you watched and you went quiet, and you let me go quiet too, because it was easier and a child shouldn't have to learn to disappear in her own house." "I know," Vera said. She did not flinch from it. She had clearly said it to herself many times in the gray coat in the cousin's spare room in Waynesville in the long nights. "I know all of that. Every word of it is true, and I'm not going to argue with any of it." "I'm not saying no," Lark said. "I'm saying it takes time. I'm saying you don't get the year back by driving here in the snow, but I'm not saying no." "I have time," Vera said. "I have all the time there is. I'm not in a hurry. I've spent a long time being in a hurry to get out of rooms, and I'm done with that. I can be slow now. Slow is all I want to be." Lark looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she set down her cup. "The gearing on the west side needs adjusting," she said. "I've been putting it off because I can't hold the iron fitting steady and drive the pin at the same time. It takes 2 people, and I've only got me." "Show me," Vera said. Blythe came to the mill for the first time in March. She had not come before. She had offered several times in the practical way she offered things without pressure, as information available to be accepted or declined without either being significant, and Lark had not declined and had also not accepted, which Blythe had understood correctly as meaning not yet, and had waited accordingly. She was a patient woman. She had been kneading bread since before Lark was born, and patience was built into her relationship with time, into the way she let dough rise on its own schedule and refused to rush it, knowing that some things cannot be hurried without being ruined. She arrived on a Saturday morning in mud season when the trail was at its worst, the thaw-freeze cycle reducing the packed earth to a surface that sucked at boots and coated everything in a gray clay that had no intention of releasing its grip. She wore tall rubber boots and carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and a second bag in her other hand, and she arrived at the mill slightly winded from the climb, but otherwise the same as she had always been, substantial and present, and not requiring any response in particular. Vera was there at the mill that day, the 2 women meeting for the first time. The woman who had failed the child and the woman who had caught her regarding each other with a wary courtesy that contained a whole conversation neither of them would ever have out loud, and then setting it aside because there was a mill to attend to and the present was more interesting than the past. Blythe stood in the mill room for a long time watching the wheel and listening to the stones. She put her hand on the runner stone the way Odell Maynard had, not inspecting, but something more interior, some form of reception that bypassed assessment and went directly to understanding. Her forearms, developed by 40 years of dough, rested on the stone surface, and she closed her eyes and stayed that way, and the stone turned slowly under the heel of her hand, and the cornmeal dust hung in the air in the light from the window. When she opened her eyes, she looked at Lark. "I have something for you," she said. "I've had it a long time, longer than I've known you. I wasn't sure what to do with it, and then you came into the bakery at 4 in the morning asking for work, and I still wasn't sure. And then you bought this place, and I thought maybe, And then you got the mill running, the actual wheel turning, and I thought, she paused, and Blythe Sutton did not pause often and did not do it the way uncertain people did it. So when she did it meant something was being weighed on a serious scale. I thought if the wheel runs and the stones turn and someone is keeping this going, then what I've been holding belongs here, with you, with the mill. It doesn't belong in a drawer in my apartment anymore. It never did. She set the canvas bag on the surface of the bedstone and opened it and took out a large envelope. Not new. Old, the manila paper soft and mottled with age, the flap sealed with a strip of tape that had dried out years ago and resealed only partially, the corner of the flap lifting. It had been opened and closed multiple times. The way you open and close something you don't know what to do with, but can't bring yourself to let go of, the way you take a thing out and look at it and put it back year after year. In 2003, Blythe said, I was new to Flower and Stone. I just bought it from the previous owner, a man named Harker, who had run it for 30 years and was winding down, moving to Florida to be near his grandchildren. The first week I took over, before he'd finished clearing out, a woman came into the bakery. She was somewhere in her 60s. She'd driven all the way from Knoxville. She asked about the Greer Mill, said she'd been trying to get up here for years, that the road wasn't passable, that she'd asked a ranger one time, and he'd told her the trail was too rough and too far, and she'd gone home and waited and tried again. And Blythe put her hand flat on the envelope. She had a bad heart. She told us plain, the way some people her age will tell you their whole medical history standing at a counter. She said her doctor had told her that year that the trail wasn't going to be possible for her, not anymore, not with her heart. She couldn't make 2 miles in that terrain. Her body wouldn't carry her to the one place in the world she wanted to go. She looked at Lark, and then at Vera, and then back at Lark. She wrote a letter right there at the counter on a piece of bakery paper, and then she went home and mailed a better copy. She left it with Harker, and she left her address in Knoxville, and she asked him to get it to whoever was living at the mill, if anyone ever was. Harker gave it to me when he handed over the keys. Said he'd never found anyone up there to give it to. Said as far as he knew, the place was empty and had been empty his whole life and would be empty forever, and he was sorry, but he didn't know what else to do with it but pass it along, and now it was my problem. She slid the envelope across the stone to Lark. She left her name, Blythe said, Clara Greer. She said her family name was Greer and that her father had built the mill and that she'd grown up there. Lark did not pick it up right away. She looked at the envelope on the gray surface of the bedstone in the light from the window, the cornmeal dust settling on it, the soft, worn manila that had been opened and closed for 20 years by a woman who did not know what she was holding either, and she felt the whole shape of the thing arrive in her at once, the way the most important things arrived in her chest before her head. Clara had come. Clara had come as close as a bakery 7 miles down a mountain road, and her heart had stopped her 2 miles short of the place her father built. And she had written a letter and gone home and waited and died. And the letter had sat in a drawer for 20 years until a small girl who had also been thrown away came up a trail and made the wheel turn again. She picked it up. She did not open it there. She took it upstairs to the table by the south window, and she sat down, and Blythe and Vera stayed below in the mill room by some shared understanding and gave her the room. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds. The handwriting was deliberate and slightly effortful, the writing of someone for whom the physical act had become harder than it once was, the letters formed with care, but with a faint tremor in the longer strokes. The paper had the texture of having been handled soft at the folds, as though the person who wrote it had held it and reread it more than once before sealing it, the way Silas had reread the letter he wrote his daughter, the same blood doing the same thing across 50 years. To whoever is living at the Greer Mill on Beckett Creek. My name is Clara Greer. I am the daughter of Silas Greer, who ran the mill from 1921 to 1958. I grew up there until I was 13 years old, when my father sent me to the Holston Children's Home in Knoxville because of the flood. He sent me money when he could every few months in the mail, and I knew it was from him because of the way he wrote my name. I waited for him to come and get me. He never did. He died in 1962, and no one told me for 6 years, and by then I was grown, and there was nothing to go back to that anyone knew of. I have wanted to go back to the mill my whole life. I have not been able to. I am not able now. My heart is not what it was, and the trail is beyond me, the doctor says, and I believe him, though I do not want to. I am not writing to make a claim on the property. Whatever has happened to it in all the years since my father died is done, and I am not writing about that. I am writing because I want to know if his things are there. He used to talk about the mill the way some people talk about a person they love. He said the creak sounded like someone talking in another room. He said the stones were good. He said one day I would hear them again. I never did. I just want to know if his mill is standing. I just want to know if anyone is taking care of it. I have a daughter. Her name is Jessie. She lives near me in Knoxville. Maybe someday she will be able to go where I could not, and stand where I cannot stand, and hear what I never got to hear. My father used to say a mill is a useful thing. A place that feeds people is a place worth keeping. I believed him when I was a girl, and I believe him still. Thank you for reading this, whoever you are. Clara Greer, April 2003. Beneath the letter was a folded piece of notepaper, newer the fold crisp. Blythe had added it herself. Lark could see in Blythe's blocky, practical hand. A Knoxville address, a phone number, and one line: Clara died in 2005. Her daughter Jessie still lives at this address as of last year I checked. I found all this again going through Harker's old box in 2022, and I have not known what to do about it since. B. Lark put the letter down on the table. She sat with it for a long time, the fire in the stove ticking the creak through the floor, the afternoon light coming through the south windows at its low March angle. From below came the intermittent sound of her mother and Blythe, two women who had just met talking low, and then the tap and pause and tap of someone testing the gearing Vera, showing Blythe what they had been working on, the small, ordinary sounds of a place that had people in it again. Clara had come as close as the bakery. She had stood 7 miles from the place where her father had built a life and hidden a fortune in mason jars and written her name on the back of a letter, and she had not been able to make the trail. She had died 2 years later without ever knowing whether the mill was standing, without ever knowing that her name was on that letter, without ever knowing that the man who sent her away had spent the rest of his life trying to find a way to bring her back. She had a daughter, Jessie. Lark picked up the piece of notepaper with Jessie's address and held it, and the question that had been sitting behind a stone wall for 60 years and in her own hands for 9 months finally became a thing she could do something about. She wrote the letter that evening after Blythe had gone back down the trail and Vera had gone to sleep on the cot in the corner. She sat at the table with the Knoxville address in front of her and a piece of paper and a pen, and she thought carefully about what she was writing and to whom, and what it should contain and what it should not. She was not a person who wrote letters. She was a person who noticed things and fixed things and kept things running. And letters were a different kind of making, but the principle was the same. You thought about what the thing was for and you built it to do that, no more. She wrote, "My name is Lark Holloway. I am 19 years old. I own and operate the Greer Mill on Beckett Creek in Madison County, North Carolina. I bought it last year for $10 at a tax sale, and I have spent the year repairing it. The water wheel is running. The grinding stones are turning. The mill is producing flour, and people drive a long way to buy it. Your grandmother's father, Silas Greer, built this mill, or rather his grandfather built it, and Silas ran it, and I have restored what they made, and it works the way it was meant to work. I found your grandmother's letter. It came to me through Blythe Sutton at the Flour and Stone Bakery in Asheville, who held it for 20 years, not knowing who to give it to. I have read it many times. I also found other things. Under the floor of the upper room, Silas hid his life savings in 12 mason jars and a letter. In a hidden space in the millroom wall, he hid a photograph and a paper that explains why your grandmother left, which was not what she thought it was. I think you should read all of it. I think you should have all of it. The mill is standing, the creek is clean, the wheel is turning. Your great-grandfather built every stone of it. And on the back of his letter, he wrote a line to your grandmother that I think she never got to read, and I would rather not put it in this letter because some things should be read off the page. He wrote them on and not copied out by a stranger. If you want to come and see it and to read it where he wrote it, you are welcome here. I will help you up the trail if you need help. Lark Holloway. She folded the letter and addressed the envelope and drove to the post office in Hot Springs the next morning through the mud and the thaw and mailed it. And then she went back up the trail and ground 40 pounds of wheat and did not let herself think about it because thinking about a thing you have sent into the world and cannot call back is a way of wearing yourself out for no purpose. Jessie arrived on a Tuesday in late May. She drove from Knoxville in a blue Ford pickup and parked at the Forest Service turnaround and walked the 2 miles up the trail with a day pack on her back. And when she came around the bend and saw the mill, she stopped in the trail and stood still for a long moment, the way her mother might have stood, the way Odell had stood, the way everyone stood the first time, as though the building required a pause before it could be approached. She was in her early 50s, medium height, with the build of someone who worked physically strong across the shoulders with gray coming into her dark hair. At the temples that she wore, pulled back simply, and she had the quality of self-containment that belongs to people who have carried difficult things for a long time and have organized themselves around the weight, who have built their lives the way Clara built hers, around an absence at the center. Lark met her at the door. They looked at each other for a moment, two people who had been connected by a place and a man and a series of letters, and 60 years before they had ever stood in the same physical space. There was nothing performative about the moment. It simply was what it was. "The wheel is running," Jessie said. "Yes," Lark said. "My mother described that sound to me, the wheel and the water. She'd heard it as a small child before she went to Knoxville. She said—" Jessie stopped and started again the family habit, the gathering before the hard sentence. She said her father told her the sound of the stones carried down the valley on still mornings, that people could hear it from their porches and know things were working the way they should. She used to say that to me when I was little. I didn't know what it meant. I thought it was just a thing she said. She was looking at the wheel. The May Creek was full and fast with spring runoff, and the wheel was turning at its best pace, the water hitting each paddle with authority, the arcs off the trailing edge catching the morning light and throwing it back in pieces. "That's what she always talked about," Jessie said. "Not the place, really. Not the building, the sound. She talked about the sound her whole life." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She drove here in 2003. Did the baker tell you—" "She made it as far as the bakery," Lark said. Her heart wouldn't let her go further. She wrote a letter and went home. Jessie nodded slowly, looking at the ground and then at the wheel again. "She came home from that trip and cried for 2 days," she said. "First time I'd ever seen my mother cry. Only time. She was not a woman who cried. She'd had it trained out of her growing up the way she did. But she came back from North Carolina, and she sat at her kitchen table, and she cried, and she wouldn't tell me why, and I was a grown woman by then with my own kids, and I didn't push, and I have regretted not pushing every day since she died." She turned from the wheel to Lark. "And then your letter came, after 20 years. And I sat at the same kitchen table, her table I kept it, and I read it, and I understood for the first time what she'd been crying about. She'd gotten this close, and she had to turn around, and she never knew if any of it was still here." "Come in," Lark said. "There's a lot to show you. We can take it slow." She gave Jessie the letter first. Silas's letter, the original, in the leather pouch with the brown twine. She set it on the table by the south window, the same table where she had read Clara's letter, and Jessie untied the twine and unfolded the paper with the care that the age of it required, and read it, the whole valley quiet around them, the wheel turning below the stones, grinding their low note up through the floor. She read it through once without speaking. Then she turned it over and read the 2 lines on the back. "Clara, my girl, if you find this first, the mill is yours. I built every stone of it for you." She read it again. She put the letter down on the table. She put her hands flat on the table on either side of it, the way her grandfather might have put his hands on a millstone. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then she looked at the south window, at the forest outside the May forest, in full leaf, the chestnut oaks and the tulip poplars, and the rhododendron showing its first purple blooms along the creek bank. Then she looked down at her hands. She did not cry. She was still for a long time, and then she breathed in slowly and let it out. And when she spoke, her voice was steady in the way that costs something to keep steady. She never knew, she said. If she'd known he wrote her name on this letter, if she'd known what was here all those years. She stopped. She tried again. She spent 40 years thinking he sent her away because he didn't want her. She got his money in the mail every few months, the money orders, and she thought it was guilt. She thought it was a man paying off a debt to make himself feel better. She never. Her hand moved to the edge of the letter, her fingertips on the worn paper. She never once thought it was love. She never knew he was saving the whole thing for her. The mill, the money, all of it. Every dollar in those jars he was saving for the day he could bring his girl home. The creek ran under the floor. The wheel turned outside. The grinding stones in the mill room below rotated with their low circular murmur, steady as the creek, steady as time, the same sound Clara had heard as a child and chased her whole life and never heard again. Lark set the photograph on the table. Silas and Clara, 1947. The man with his face turned slightly away from the camera, the girl with her arm raised, pointing at something outside the frame. Both of them with their feet on this earth beside this creek in front of these stones, in a year before the flood, before Knoxville, before any of it. When a father and his daughter could stand in the sun and she could point at a thing and he could turn to look. Jessie looked at the photograph for a long time. She touched the edge of it with one finger, not the surface, the edge, the way you touch something you are afraid to disturb. She would have been 8, she said quietly. That's what my mother looked like at 8 years old. She stopped. There were no pictures. Nothing came with her from Holston. Whatever was in the house got cleared out and sold off when the county took the property, and she spent her whole life trying to find out where any of it went and never could. She didn't have a single photograph of her father, not one. She didn't know what he looked like by the end. She'd lost the face. She told me that once that she'd started to lose his face, and it frightened her more than anything. She looked up from the photograph. She would have given anything in the world for this, she said. Anything. Lark said, "It's yours." Jessie looked at her. "Everything I found here that belonged to Silas, it's yours," Lark said. "The letter, the photograph, the transfer paper from Holston, the coins that are left after what I spent on the mill. I kept what I needed to fix this place, because that's what his letter told me to do, use them to keep the mill standing, and I did. I kept it standing, and the rest is Clara's, which means it's yours and your children's. It was always going to belong to whoever came up that trail with her blood in them, and that's you." Jessie was quiet for a moment. "The mill," she said carefully. I didn't drive here too." "The mill is mine," Lark said gently before the worry could finish forming. "I bought it and I rebuilt it and I run it and I'm going to keep running it, and that's not what any of this is about. This isn't about the mill. The mill found the person it needed. This is about giving you back what was yours to begin with. There's a difference between the building and the things inside it that have your family's name on them, and I've had a year to think about the difference, and I'm sure of it." Jessie looked at her steadily. The quality of looking between them was the quality of two people who have arrived at an understanding without having to negotiate one, who recognize in each other some common foundation that makes the negotiation unnecessary. Two women who had both been left in different ways by people who should not have left them, and who had both in different ways refused to become the leaving. "She just wanted to know he loved her," Jessie said. That was the whole of it. Her entire life, under everything else, that was the only thing she ever really wanted. To know. She touched the 2 lines on the back of the letter one more time. "Clara, my girl." And he did, the whole time. He just couldn't figure out how to reach her across the distance, and then he ran out of time and she ran out of time, and it took a stranger with a tax receipt to carry it the last mile. She looked at Lark. You carried it the last mile. The fire in the stove ticked softly. The creek ran. Outside from somewhere down the valley came the sound of a woodpecker working a dead tree. The rapid, precise percussion carrying through the May forest like a small, emphatic announcement that the day was getting on with itself. Would you like to see the mill room? Lark said. They went down the narrow stair together, the same stair Clara had run up and down as a girl. The treads worn concave by 60 years of Silas and 100 years of Greer's before him, and now a year of Lark. Vera was at the gear mechanism with a wrench adjusting the drive connection on the axle housing. Her sleeves rolled up flour dust on her forearms. She looked up when they came in, nodded at Jesse, a nod that contained a whole welcome, and went back to what she was doing, because she had learned over the months when a moment belonged to her daughter and when it belonged to someone else, and this one was not hers, and she had the grace at last to know it. The grinding stones were turning. Jesse walked to them and stood beside the runner stone, watching it rotate, feeling the vibration come up through the stone floor into the soles of her boots and up through her legs. The smell of fresh cornmeal was in the air. They had ground a batch of Bloody Butcher that morning, the corn's particular sweetness still hanging in the dust that settled on every surface of the mill room by the end of a grinding day. She put her hand on the runner stone, flat palm the way Odell Maynard had done it, and the way Blythe had done it, and the way Lark herself had done it on that first afternoon in February, needing to feel the weight and the cold and the motion of the thing through her own skin. She closed her eyes. She stood that way for a long time, her palm on the turning stone, the cornmeal dust in the light from the window, the wheel groaning faintly outside the creek rising through the floor. When she opened her eyes, they were wet, but she was not crying. She was doing something more interior than crying, something that did not need to come out, but only to be recognized privately in the company of the stone and the sound and the 150 years of accumulated presence in the room. That's the sound, she said, not loudly. She told me about this sound my whole life, the low rumble you feel in your feet more than hear with your ears. She said it sounded like the whole building had a heartbeat. She kept her hand on the stone. I always thought she was exaggerating, the way you do about the things you loved as a child. I thought she'd made it bigger than it was the way memory does. She felt the stone turn under her palm. She didn't make it bigger. It's exactly what she said. It's exactly that sound. The wheel turned. The stones turned. The creek ran beneath them, speaking its low, indistinct language to the bedrock it had been running over since before any human thought to listen to it. She could hear it, Jessie said quietly to the stone to the room to her mother. Wherever she is, I know she can hear it now. Jessie stayed 3 days. She slept on a folding cot they set up in the corner of the upper room and woke early and helped with the morning grinding and learned the sequence of opening the sluice and monitoring the feed and adjusting the gate to manage the speed of the wheel in the variable flow of the May Creek. She was competent with physical work in the way that people who have never thought of themselves as particularly mechanical sometimes turn out to be when placed in front of a machine that has a comprehensible logic and a willingness to be understood. And Lark thought, watching her, that it was in the blood that Silas was in those hands, that some things travel down a family line, whether or not anyone is there to teach them. In the evenings, they sat on the flat creekside rock and talked, the four of them. Sometimes Lark and Jessie and Vera and Blythe when Blythe stayed over, and sometimes just Lark and Jessie in the long May light, with the trees fully leafed and the trail a green tunnel of rhododendron and ironwood. Jessie talked about her mother the way Clara had organized her life around the absence at its center, building around the wound, rather than ever healing it, which is what most people do with the things they cannot change. She had been a careful woman, Clara Greer, careful and competent, and quietly lonely in the specific way of people who have learned not to need things, because needing things had historically led to disappointment. She had kept a postcard on her mantelpiece. Jessie said not a photograph of Silas, she had never had one, but a cheap postcard of the North Carolina mountains, the kind sold off a wire rack at a gas station, blue ridges receding into haze. She had bought it somewhere sometime and put it on the mantle, and Jessie had grown up with it there without ever understanding entirely what it meant to her mother, only that it meant something that could not be said directly, that it was a window her mother looked through to a place she could not reach. On the last morning before Jessie walked the trail back down to her truck, they stood outside the mill in the early light, the wheel turning in the fresh cold of the May morning, the creek running fast and clear over the pale stones. Jessie had the leather pouch in the photograph and the transfer paper in her day pack wrapped in a clean cloth in the silver coins that remained, which Lark had insisted on in a cloth bag, and the weight of all of it on her back was the weight of a story finally arriving where it had been trying to go for 60 years. My mother asked me something once near the end, Jessie said. She was in the hospital and her mind was wandering some the way it does. She asked me whether I thought her father had still been running the mill when she got old enough to come back. Whether the stones were still turning all those years while she was in Knoxville waiting. I didn't know what to tell her. I had no idea. I told her I was sure they were because that's what you say, but I didn't know, and I think she knew I didn't know. She looked at the wheel. I know now, she said. They weren't then. They'd stopped. He died and they stopped and they sat still for 60 years. She turned to Lark. But they're turning now, and I'm going to tell her. I know I know people don't. I know she's gone. She stopped and let it be what it was. I talked to her. I have since she died. I'm going to go to the cemetery when I get home, and I'm going to tell her the stones are running again and that someone is keeping the place the way her father asked, the way her father always wanted, and that I stood where she couldn't stand and put my hand on the stone, and that it's exactly the sound she said it was. Exactly that sound. Lark nodded. Tell her the flower sells out every week, she said. Tell her people drive 3 hours for it. Tell her it tastes like something. Jessie smiled, the first full smile Lark had seen from her in 3 days. A smile with her mother somewhere in it, and her great-grandfather somewhere in it too. She picked up her pack and settled it on her shoulders. She stood for a moment with the mill behind her and the creek beside her and the morning forest all around, and the sound of the stones coming up through the stone walls of the building her great-great-grandfather had built in 1871 with stones. He cut from this creek bed, fitting them together without mortar, trusting the geometry and the weight, building a thing meant to outlast every hand that touched it. He was right, Jessie said, about the sound. It does carry. She looked up the valley and down it listening. You can hear it everywhere. She walked down the trail into the forest, and the rhododendron tunnel closed behind her, green and cool, and she was gone, carrying her family home in a day pack, the last mile of a 60-year journey, covered at last on foot downhill in the Maylight. Odell Maynard came in June, as she always came, in the rubber boots and the canvas hat this time, carrying a small jar of honey and a handful of dried lavender from her garden tied with a piece of string. She arrived to find the wheel running and the smell of fresh cornmeal on the air, and Vera Holloway at the hand pump in the kitchen above drawing water for the noon meal, a thing that had become ordinary. A mother in the kitchen and Lark in the mill room, adjusting the feed stone gap with a wedge of locust, and the whole place humming with the particular life of a place that has enough people in it, but not too many. Odell set the honey and the lavender on the flat rock by the creek and stood in the mill room doorway and watched the stones turn. Lark had told her over the spring, the whole of it, Clara in Knoxville and the flood and the letter in the wall, and Jessie told it in pieces across several of the visits, and Odell had received each piece with the stillness of a woman who had waited 60 years to learn the end of a story and was not going to rush the telling now that it had finally come. Cutter tells me you ground 40 pounds of wheat last week, she said. 42, Lark said. Odell was quiet. She looked at the gearing and the wheel and the arc of water coming off the paddles through the open downstream window. She looked at the mill room floor, clean swept the old iron fittings, oiled the wooden gear teeth, sound and tight, the work of a year, the work of 150 years, all of it holding. The summer I was 9, she said, I came up this trail 41 times. I kept count in a little paper book my mother gave me, made a mark each time. I've still got it somewhere. My mother sent me with corn and I brought back flour, and Silas always gave me something to eat and told me to watch my feet on the roots. She put her hand on the door frame, the old oak frame worn smooth at shoulder height, where 100 years of hands had rested, including, she did not have to say, the small hand of a girl named Clara. I'm 84 years old. I buried a husband and two of my brothers and most everyone I went to school with. I did not think I would hear these stones again before my own time came. I'd made my peace with not hearing them. You make your peace with a great many things at my age. It's most of what's left to do. She looked at Lark. But I've heard them, she said. Exactly that sound. The same sound from when I was a girl on that rock with a biscuit in my hand waiting. That's the sound. She let go of the doorframe and her hand came away with the faintest dusting of cornmeal on it. And she looked at it for a second, the flour on her old fingers, and then she wiped it gently on her trousers. Exactly that sound. She stayed for coffee as she always did, sitting on the flat creekside rock in the June morning, while the creek ran clear and fast over its pale stones, and the wheel turned steadily behind them, the new oak paddles weathering now to match the old frame, the old locust axle and the iron fittings that Silas's grandfather had forged in 1871, still in place, still doing what they were made to do, still holding the weight. Lark sat beside her and drank her coffee and listened to the water. In the mill room, the stones turned. In the kitchen above, Vera moved quietly, the sound of her steps familiar now on the chestnut floor, learning the rhythm of the building, the way all of them had learned it slowly and by repetition until it became the rhythm of her own days. There had been no single moment of forgiveness, no scene, no speech. There had been only the accumulation of days, the gearing fixed together, the meals cooked, the trail walk, the long, slow work of a creek, wearing down a stone, and somewhere in the accumulation, a thing had shifted. Not all the way, maybe never all the way, but far enough that a mother and a daughter could share a kitchen in a silence, and have the silence be a peaceful one. Reed Conover had sent a third letter in April. The third offer the number higher this time. Lark had set it on the table unopened, looked at it for a moment, and then put it in the wood stove and gone back to work, and the paper had burned. And the offer had burned with it, and she had not thought about it since. The creek ran beneath the building. The wheel turned in the clear June morning. The smell of fresh ground cornmeal came out through the millroom door and moved down the trail toward the valley on the light mountain air, faint and sweet and specific. The particular smell of grain made useful of stone, doing the work it had always been built to do of a place that turned grain into flour, and so was by the only measure that had ever mattered to Silas Greer worth keeping. Down the valley, 3 miles away on a porch where Odell Maynard's family had lived for 4 generations, a young woman who was Odell's great niece was setting the table for breakfast, and she stopped a plate in her hand and tilted her head and listened. From far up the creek carried on the still morning air, the way Silas had said it would carry, the way Clara had described it her whole life, the way Jessie now believed her mother could hear it from wherever she had gone, came a low, steady sound almost below hearing a rhythm, felt as much as heard the sound of 2 stones turning against each other, and a wheel turning in the water, and a whole building working the way it should. She set the plate down, she turned toward the sound, and she said to no one in particular, to her family, to the morning, to the valley that had waited 60 years to hear it again, "I can hear the mill." And the others came to the door and they listened, and they could.